The orbitals above Inquisitorial headquarters were a colossal mess, straining the cogitators of orbital traffic control to their limit. It wasn't just the presence of the task force mustering to counterattack the sudden Tyrannid incursion, or the tense standoff between the rogue Inquisitor's semi-surrendered battleship and the Inquisitorial fleet. It wasn't even the frenzy of shuttle traffic as the Inquisition mustered its ground forces and the PDF scrambled to bring themselves to something approaching readiness. No, it was all that plus the steadily increasing volume of merchant vessels pouring into the system in search of news, safety, and highly profitable Munitorum contracts. It was all Orb Trafcan could do to keep the civilian vessels corralled, even with the prospect of the Inquisition and Navy's zero-strike policies backing them up. Given the mess, it wasn't surprising that the stubby merchant vessel's arrival went unnoticed. The free trader Event Horizon, as its IF beacon identified it, popped out of the warp at a noticeable angle to its own portal, accompanied by a restrained burst of malevolent psychic energy, with all but the most expendable astropaths locked in their sanctums, shielding their sensitive minds from the Tyrannid warp shadow shrouding the system. Nobody noticed the event, or the subsequent change in the warp shadow shrouding the system as its source translated into real space, between its falsified beacon and a cunningly disguising emission profile, via the replacement of 2 engines, the complete absence of another, and a persistent atmosphere leak from somewhere on deck 6, or maybe 9 if, you know, the screen's upside down. The occurrence border slipped into orbit almost completely unnoticed by Inquisitorial headquarters, along with the standard station chirping comms, polite inquiries into the stability of the ship's reactor, and unsolicited refit contract offers. The occurrence border received a single mundane communique from the Administrative Auxiliary Liaison Office. Among other things, the message contained a pre-filled form for the return of misfiled evidential materials and directions for its immediate filing. This form was printed, signed, and submitted via second-hand Astard stealth shuttle. The stealth shuttle attracted even less notice than the ship it departed from, which was entirely the point. It slipped into the steady stream of shuttle traffic moving between the mustering Imperial fleet and the staging area on the outskirts of Inquisitorial headquarters, landing on the edge of the vast muddy field that had until recently contained the Inquisitorial Penal Legion. The shuttle's occupants disembarked and split into 3 groups. The Rupert led his team towards the command building formerly belonging to the Commissariat, now hosting Lady General von Humperdinck and her sizable retinue. Jim and Hannah split off too, following their own directions to a meeting at the HQ's Shrine Primaris. The final team, consisting of 6 HQ stormtroopers, an official Inquisition-sanctioned Seeker, a Servo-Grok skull, and a single standard-issue evidence box, headed for the compound exit. The security checkpoint at the gate had changed drastically with the departure of the Penal Legion, the typical pair of bored commissariat cadets having been replaced with 2 squads of highly alert Inquisitorial stormtroopers. What the security detail didn't have, though, was a Seeker, and as Sarge stepped forwards to offer his credentials he signaled Fumbles to get ready for the critical moment he'd been practicing for all week. Things then took an abrupt turn as the stormtrooper sergeant on duty abruptly pointed a finger at Sarge and yelled, "It's you assholes." Sarge's well-honed mind abruptly leapt into panicking as he belatedly recognized the same sergeant that had been on duty at the evidence building's entrance. Fortunately, before he could do anything catastrophically stupid, the approaching stormtrooper noncom did something completely unexpected, holding out a hand and pulling Sarge into a backslapping hug when he reflexively took it. To our squad's collective amazement, all of the stormtroopers present started flipping up their helmet visors and talking excitedly. The gist was that when the dust had settled after Inquisitor Big Hat's failed infiltration, the Mir and Kia lists had been impressively long and we'd definitely been on them. We as in us. Us personally, by name, rank, and biometric ID code. Sarge desperately prevented himself from glaring at Tink, whose fault this definitely was, and tried to take solace in the fact that he'd apparently received an inquisitorial decoration for practicality, posthumous, for getting all the scribes out. There were, of course, some questions mixed in with the camaraderie. Fortunately, this being the Inquisition, Sarge's flat denial that anything had actually happened at all, ever, anywhere was accepted with good humor. To Amy's annoyance, the stormtroopers also recognized her, but since they immediately congratulated her on getting out of the commissariat and back into the guard proper, she took it with good grace. An inquiry into the love-struck stormtrooper LT revealed that the little tit was fortunately not around. Even better, since the idiot had spent most of the intervening time trying to send Amy courtship inquiries via her mother's office, the sergeant was only too willing to keep him in the dark about our little visit. To Fumble's relieved disappointment, the plan no longer called for him to mind fog us past a team of highly trained and heavily armed inquisitorial stormtroopers. Instead, our infiltration was accomplished by asking the stormtroopers for directions where to take our misfiled evidence form, and being provided with a helpful guide in the form of the familiar wheelchair-bound good scribe. They even threw in one of those electric carts for driving around groups that are too important and or fat to walk places themselves. Tink was not allowed to drive. The tour train full of stormtroopers zipped through the service tunnels of Inquisitorial headquarters, the passengers blissfully unaware of the sinister bureaucratic plot choreographing their every movement. The good scribe, who was very much aware of how much effort had gone into pre-arranging their passage through the heart of inquisitorial authority, because he'd been the one who had to do most of it, resisted the urge to point it out to the oblivious infiltration team. The scribe took solace in the fact that despite a century of paper pushing for the Inquisition instead of honest spy work, he could still run, or at least roll, with the best of them. Realization that all was not as it seemed hit the team when the good scribe took us not to an office, but a small break room with a bunch of inquisitorial adepts blocking the door. The scribe politely shooed a gap through the crowd and opened the door before anyone could ask any questions, unleashing a choking billow of smoke that drove back the inquisitorial hangers-on. Grateful for the full helmet and rebreather on his carapace armor, Sarge scanned the smoke-filled room for threats and flinched as something shot through the air towards him. Sarge's instinctive duck got him out of the way in time, which just meant that Doc caught the half-full ashtray right in the faceplate. As the medic staggered and wiped ash off his visor, a banshee-like voice screeched at us to either piss off or close the damn door before we let all the warm air out. One of the inquisitorial adepts outside grimly wished us luck before shutting the door behind us. The screeching ashtray thrower was the break room's only occupant, unless you counted the half-empty carton of smokes, and as the door slammed shut behind us, recognition hit. The familiar old lady adept, last seen pushing an evidence cart full of parking tickets at our brief inquisitorial trial, jumped up from her seat and grumpily informed us she'd been on smoke break for nearly 2 hours now. What looked to be the exact same evidence cart sat parked in the room's corner with a matching evidence box perched on top of it. Sarge sighed with relief that the plan, whatever it was, hadn't changed, and waved Fumbles forward with the box he'd been keeping everyone from noticing. Under the cover of a screeching rant about being owed years of smoke breaks and the gall of sending a squad of stormtroopers to muscle a little old lady around, the switch was made. Both boxes were unceremoniously opened and shaken out, and then Tink carefully removed the false bottom from the one we'd brought. Sweating under the gazes of everyone present, Tink transplanted the techno-heretical amalgamation of Imperial circuits, TAU Xenotech, and oddly greenish lumps of wraithbone. The Necron Tesseract perched in the middle wobbled slightly in its suspensor field, sending the little yellow note stuck to it, declaring "Do not touch. This means you Tink," flying off as it brushed the edge of the field. Tink assured everyone that the note had been more of a suggestion, and gave the ancient architect device a good poke to prove his point. Sarge instructed him to knock it off if he wanted to keep those fingers, and the swap was completed without further incident. Once the slightly battered false bottom was replaced and the jumbled pile of evidence had been crammed back into place, the feisty old adept grabbed it from us and led the way back out the door. The crowd of inquisitorial adepts staking out the break room were dispersed via the simple expedient of Sarge telling them to get lost. We would be escorting Curatoress Dench, who resented being called either old or lady, and her evidence cut on their delayed journey to wherever. The dispersal was only temporary, and probably had more to do with the curatorius haranguing them for impatience, rudeness, impropriety, and lack of both personal hygiene and dress sense. The assorted inquisitorial flunkies were visibly relieved as Sarge unceremoniously loaded both her and the cart. The chumps didn't realize they weren't being invited aboard until our tour train abruptly zipped off, the curatorius cackling madly as she floored it. In the silence that followed, the wheelchair-riding scribe congratulated the confused adepts on a job well done, and helpfully volunteered to guide them all back to their respective retinues. The Inquisitorial Administrative Auxiliary Administrator's office was feeling distinctly cramped with 3 interrogators, one from each audace, glaring futilely at the small-robed man and the 2 evidence boxes on his desk. Administrator Jurisprudence Probity Tact was no stranger to being glared at. In fact, as a lifelong adept of Departamento Diplomatum, he considered it a sign of a job well done. These specific glares were substandard though, comparing poorly to multiple lifetimes worth of infuriated dignitaries, secessionists, and Xenos. Not to mention some rather acrimonious encounters with the Officio Assassinorum, to your counterintelligence, and an enraged Bloodaxe Loud General. Even Inquisitor Sergeant, who'd catastrophically failed all his body language and non-verbal projection lessons, could pull off a better glare than the 3 interrogators. But then again, the man did have quite a bit of practice. Of course, Administrator Tact hadn't expected much from the 3 flunkies sent to harass him over the delay of the all-important evidence of Inquisitor Oak's flagrant fiscal malfeasance. All 3 interrogators, or at least their inquisitors, were well aware of how much of the subsector's inquisitorial bureaucracy had been seconded to the administrative auxiliary, as well as Tact's early reappointment to the rotating position by order of the Lord Inquisitor following the recent colossal frack-ups. What they were less aware of was just how many of their own decisions were based entirely on the auxiliary's own reports and scheduling assignments. Arranging to get 3 weasels who all hated each other wasn't particularly hard, but he took pride in managing to stick 2 known conspiracy sickers in a room with an audace Malleus Untouchable for several hours, maintaining the vaguely helpful expression he knew annoyed the self-important little shits. Administrator Tact assured them that the last evidence box would be arriving shortly. Said evidence box nearly flew off its cart as the tour train skidded to a stop in the oddly empty heart of the local inquisitorial bureaucracy. Ignoring Twitch's pointed questions about where everyone was, the curatorius took a moment to inspect her troops, adjusting Sludge and Amy's uniforms, as well as her own hair and cosmetics, and shooing Nubby to the back of the line with instructions to try and stand behind other people. Satisfied with the appearance of her honor guard, the crafty old biddy dragged Fumbles to the front of the group with her and set off at a brisk trot for the slightly fancier door at the end of the hall labeled Administrator. Next to her, Fumbles started to sweat then stagger, gamely pushing on and almost reaching the door before collapsing in a twitching heap. Whatever the 3 interrogators in the office had expected, it was not a wizened little woman in scribe's robes bursting through the door like an Astartes assault squad, screechily vowing to break her foot off in the ass of whichever irredeemably rude untouchable was walking around without their limiter on. After the brief moment of panic caused by the sudden entrance, all 3 interrogators holstered the weapons they'd drawn, and the Ordo Malleus interrogator sheepishly activated her limiter. The 2 psychically gifted interrogators, having spent nearly 2 hours pointedly not mentioning the obvious, tried not to visibly sag with relief as the oppressive anti-psychic aura abated, and tried not to look too smug as their hated colleague was forced to apologize to the cute little sicker boy. For us grunts, the hardest part of the next several minutes was trying not to stare at the damn diplomacy adept as he sat there claiming to be this important Inquisition bigwig and bossing around 3 interrogators. Or at least watching as his, accomplice minion agent was probably the best term for the retaliation between our 2 former adepts. or possibly protege, judging by the occasional proud looks the curatoress was shooting him. Whatever their relation, the administrator seemed happy to play good cop to her angry scholar mistress, calmly taking possession of the third evidence box and walking the 3 interrogators through the process of observing and certifying the evidence transfer. What was supposed to happen was a careful inventory and inspection of all items in the 3 boxes, with the interrogators verifying that all items were present, correct, and free of any warpcraft before presentation to the High Conclave. In reality, the careful inventory was more of a high-speed rubber stamping as the administrator whipped out item after item, reading out numbers and descriptions without pausing for input from the 3 inquisitorial observers. The pace didn't slow until he reached the 3rd box, opening it to reveal the disorganized jumble we'd piled into it. Seizing the opportunity to be an arsehole, the Hereticus interrogator asked whether the box had been packed by a trained scribe or a drunken guardsman. He did not seem amused when the administrator asked Sarge if he and his men were sober, before shrugging off the entirely legitimate and incredibly suspicious issue with an honestly, "It's not that bad for a guardsman," and proceeding with the inventory before anyone else could interrupt. Of course, the real problem with the whole inspection process was that the 2 sickers had just spent an extended time around the Inquisition's rudest untouchable and were in no condition to psychically verify anything. The solution was obvious though, as the curatoress immediately pointed out, because she had a qualified Inquisition-sanctioned sicker right here. And would they rather keep their inquisitors waiting even longer while they took a refreshing nap or something? Fumbles had prepared for this, actually practicing and everything, under the highly unnerving gaze of 2 highly trained and experienced Inquisition sickers. He truthfully asserted that there was nothing warpy about any of the evidence. To our relief, and the administrator's disgust, none of the interrogators even bothered to question Fumbles, seeming far more interested in sniping at each other about who should be blamed if something went wrong. Before any of the 3 interrogators remembered to do their job properly, both of the elderly spies turned bureaucrats seized the initiative, the curatoress elbowing past them and putting everything back in the boxes, while the administrator grabbed an ancient Vox set, cleared his throat, and announced that the recess will be ending shortly over the HQ's Vox system. Judging by the panic look on the 3 interrogators' faces, they'd been anticipating an hour or 2 more of bureaucratic time wasting, and probably a chance to report the news personally to their respective inquisitors and scoring some brown nose points. The Hereticus one was even dumb enough to complain about the administrator's unilateral decision, earning him a withering suggestion to go ask the Lord Inquisitor if he'd been serious about sorting things out as quickly as possible. The other 2 interrogators snickered, and then all 3 set about signing their respective stacks of forms and applying official order seals to the 3 evidence boxes. The evidence convoy was reformed, larger by 2 boxes, 3 interrogators, and 1 annoyingly smug diplostrator, and thus the final phase of our covert operation began. To our surprise, the hardest part of getting our tampered evidence boxes into Oak's trial wasn't talking our way past security, who just waved us all through when they saw the administrator, or maintaining our stormtrooper Y facade in front of the unwitting interrogators. Well, actually it was, but not in the sense of acting professionally and not gawking at Inquisition's inner sanctum like a bunch of pilgrims. No, the actual hard part was maintaining the damn perimeter without shooting anyone. Administrator Tack's announcement had unleashed something like a shift change in a hive, with inquisitorial agents of every type running in every direction. At first it wasn't an issue, with the presence of the administrator and 3 interrogators keeping the riffraff at bay, but that changed abruptly when we entered the Hollow Hall, the sepulchre of the disavowed dead. To give the massive gothic monstrosity of a room its proper name, was supposed to be a place of prayer and reflection, a place where a young budding paranoid could ponder the deeds, deaths, and stasis suspended remains of the subsector's greatest inquisitorial heroes. What it actually was something between a daycare and a guard muster field, with the collected retinues of 19 inquisitors split into separate heavily armed camps and positioned around the room based on their boss opinion of the various big holographic dead guys. With all the Inquisitors called back into the High Inquisitorium for the trial, a vague semblance of order was being maintained by the assorted interrogators. Just like any guard muster, though, there was only so much one could do to prevent fraternization of one sort or another. It wasn't just the usual poker games and the inquisitorial equivalent of nubby making the rounds. There were also dozens of little inter-retinue groups doing everything from drinking, to xenobiological trivia contests, to roasting a whole grox on a makeshift spit. The largest groups by far were the Emperor Botherers though, having set up a good dozen little congregations, ranging from a large and orderly collection of battle sisters hymning away over the altar of some saint, which they'd presumably brought with them, to a robe-wearing Ogryn preaching to a flock of sickers and twists about the glorious bigness of Dar Emperor. Needless to say, our little convoy caught the attention of just about everyone present, it being the first actual interesting thing to happen in the last several hours, and a steadily growing crowd formed around us and our charge. Lacking the self-preservation the Emperor gave an Ogryn, the unruly mob of inquisitorial agents, and yes, it was definitely a mob, responded to Sludge's bellows to make way either with annoyed indifference, or by actively coming closer to check out what was going on. The three interrogators were worse than useless, chatting with acquaintances in the crowd while the convoy ground to a near halt. At least until the curatoress reached over and turned the Malleus Untouchables limiter back off. Doc caught the collapsing fumbles without missing a beat, and Sarge gave the order to clear the way and keep the violence to a medium. It turned out to be Tink who had the hardest job of the escort detail. As guardsmen we were all fully qualified when it came to angry shouting, inventive cursing, and semi-targeted violence, albeit a bit half-heartedly on Doc's part and over-enthusiastically on Nubby and Amy's. Twitch was just glad to finally have a situation where brandishing a las pistol while screaming at everyone to stay back was not only allowed, but actively encouraged. Tink, though, was stuck dealing with the increasing numbers of Siburscles, cherubs, Aquili, and anything else a cogboy was willing to staple an anti-grav unit onto. Worryingly, Tink's initial attempts to fend them off using Spot 3.0's jamming field just redirected the Cyberstalker's attention to his drone. Incredibly belatedly, Tink realized that he'd never seen an actual servo Grok skull himself, and it might not have been the best choice of disguise for his massively techno-heretical Xenotech toy. Panicking more than a little, Tink set his equally techno-heretical plasma gun to fry and hosed the airspace. This had, as literally anyone else could have predicted, the exact same result as his first ploy. Fortunately, before Tink could blow the entire mission single-handedly, Jim and Hannah's part of the plan trademark sign kicked in. From 1 minute to the next the flock of assorted flying bullshit dropped by 3/4. As without a fuss or anything so primitive as a spoken word to their inquisitorial colleagues, every single cogboy in the room left to go take care of Mechanicus business. Tink smugly declared victory and turned the much smaller job over to Twitch and his comparatively standard shoeless pistol. At least it was easy to find the correct exit from the massive room, there being only one with an entire platoon of Malleus stormtroopers stationed in front of it. As our convoy approached, the Malleus boys kept us covered like proper guardsmen. Unlike all the headquarters stormtroopers we'd met so far, they didn't just wave us through at the sight of tact and the interrogators. In a gratifying show of proper guard security procedures, their LT held up a hand to stop us a good 20 meters out and waved forwards 2 troopers with Jenna scanners as well as a sapper with a full detection kit, to the mutual disgust of us and the Malleus stormtroopers. Not to mention Tact, who'd spent quite a bit of effort getting our Jenna codes re-registered. The untouchable interrogator waved the inspection team off. At their inquisitorial superior's order, the stormtroopers grudgingly let us through, the LT behaving and responding in the stiff parade ground fashion of sulky junior officers everywhere. The second checkpoint, because of course there was a second checkpoint and a third too because in the name of stereotypical paranoia, each ordo had to have their own, went much the same, except with less professional paranoia and more psalm singing about bringing holy fire to the treasonous. The Sisters of Battle guarding the Hereticus checkpoint didn't even make an effort to bring out any scanning gear. accepting the mere presence of the Hereticus interrogator as good enough. We collectively sneered behind our visors at them, though Nubby's accompanying rude gesture earned him a fist to the back of the helmet from Amy. The third checkpoint didn't take any shit, because the third checkpoint was a pair of Deathwatch Space Marines. At the third and final door between our convoy and the Grand Inquisitorium, our interrogators were informed in no uncertain terms that they wouldn't be going any farther. The elderly curatoress sneered cheerfully at them, informing the three that courtrooms were for adults only to find a massive ceramite hand on her bony shoulder and a basso voice informing her that she, her evidence cart, and the unconscious sicker weren't going in either. The ensuing argument was very short and completely one-sided, one of the Deathwatch Marines simply picking up the loudly protesting old woman by the back of her robes with one hand, grabbing Fumbles off Doc's back with the other, and barking at the interrogators to get the cart and turn the damned untouchables limiter back on. As the one Deathwatch Marine left with his escortees, the second gave the rest of us a once-over with his helmet sensors. We passed inspection without comment, though the Marine did spend a rather long time looking at Ink's weapon and insisted on triple checking Nubby's Genescan. At no point did the Space Marine notice the small, invisible TAU drone hovering just overhead, which was sort of worrying given the guy's occupation, and Spot was quietly left to cover our rear as we were waved forwards, giving Tact a solemn nod, and a vague gesture and grunt towards the boxes, the Codex approved signal for get your shit together. The Space Marine turned to the massive blast door behind him and opened it, with his hands grabbing the big ornate wheel set in its center and twisting it with the entire force of his power armored frame until the massive thing cracked open wide enough for us to get through, silently giving props to whichever paranoid bastard decided their final security measure should just be a really heavy door. We carefully squeezed around the straining Marine and practically ran into the subsector's Deathwatch captain, the towering black-clad Space Marine standing way too close to the opening doorway wasn't wearing a name tag saying Watch Captain insert name here or anything, but our honed inquisitorial instincts left us with little doubt as to his rank. It wasn't just one thing, there was the ornate armor, the fancy power sword, and the weird metal disc thingies that Space Marines hammer into their skulls instead of just using rank insignias like normal people. Mostly though, it was that, in the time-honored traditions of senior officers across the Imperium, the frackwit wasn't wearing his damn helmet. This did absolutely nothing to diminish the sheer menacing force of his glare as he greeted Administrator Tact. Tact actually flinched, though it took our years serving with him as our adept to notice the slight movement. Responding with all the charm and grace we most definitely lacked, the administrator went into damage control, assuring the angry Marine that this would definitely be the last delay. Sudge, immediately deciding this was some textbook officer business, marshaled everyone into an orderly parade carrying the three boxes between us in pairs. Behind us, the cracked door slammed back shut, accompanied by the unpleasantly warpy sensation of a ship-grade void shield activating. The administrator relaxed slightly as the door closed, and tactfully, how else, segued the conversation onto the subject of just how much longer Oak's trial would last, whether there really was an administrative auxiliary administration, analytic analysis arm, there was, and if they'd really predicted that the evidence boxes we were carrying would resolve Oak's case within 9 hours, they had, but not in their official reports. The Deathwatch captain obviously believed Tack knew what he was talking about. The angry Marine's entire demeanor changed, his frustration replaced by slightly comical excitement for a brief moment, before hardening into seriousness, eyeing the boxes, and us by extension, with far more scrutiny than we were comfortable with. The Deathwatch captain leaned down and quietly, for a Space Marine, asked Tact if he thought Oak would invoke the right of counter-accusation. The administrator, in the lecturing tone we'd all grown far too familiar with during briefings, pointed out that while the right had been invoked in only 9% of intra-inquisitorial trials, the other 91 consisted entirely of those inquisitors tried either in absentia or posthumously. The Space Marine looked a little sheepish as he stood back up and began checking his war gear. Amy's snide remark over the Vox about remembering to check his helmet was cut off in an abrupt eep as the captain casually checked the draw of his power sword directly over her head, snapping at both Amy and the Death Watch captain to behave themselves. Administrator Tact strode up to the ornately carved dolomite of the Grand Inquisitorium's service entrance and poked the admission rune. Inquisitor Quirkus, known as Oak to everyone without a rod up their ass, including himself, once he'd gotten over his own fundamental rigidity, sat on the brilliantly illuminated central platform of the Grand Interrogatorium. Tiered platforms loomed around him, their blur fields obscuring Oak's view of his inquisitorial peers. But the glaring Gothic frescoes of the 127th Centennial Architectural Budget Committee decorating the ceiling made a decent substitute. Under their disapproving gazes, Oak breathed deeply and evenly and thanked the Emperor for the restraint chair he'd been chained into, because he'd probably have passed out if he had to stand on his own right then. It wasn't the whole trial and potential execution that had Oak on edge. That had been part of the plan since pretty much the beginning. He'd needed demon bait, and here he was, acting out this farce in a desperate attempt to lure the damn thing somewhere even it couldn't escape. He'd walked into this knowing all that. The terrifying part was all the stuff he hadn't known about, at least not until Administrator Tact walked into the room and said the codel phrase. Oak shuddered as the precise cadences of Administrator Tact's greeting to the Lord Inquisitor triggered the augmetic data array hidden in somewhere in the lower middle-ish of his brain. Centuries worth of self-deception and comforting lies were burned away by a rampaging tide of suppressed memories. For the first time in almost a century, Inquisitor Oak had all the facts. He understood the plan. He knew why he'd let himself walk into such an obvious trap, and what he needed to do next. And then came the appalling realization that he really had been dumb enough to sell a Necron ship to a rogue trader, at least by proxy, and then he'd covered it all up to hide his embezzlement of an actual Tesseract labyrinth. The one thing he didn't understand was why said proxy was standing here in the courtroom holding said Tesseract. Oak just could not fathom why Tact had brought his most disaster-prone subordinates to this critical juncture, especially given the promises he'd given to Lady General von Humperdinck about her daughter's personal safety. The heiress in question was boggling at the assembled inquisitors like a tourist while casually waving around a fracking TAU pulse rifle and chatting with what appeared to be the Imperium's only rattling stormtrooper. The fact that they were literally carrying the evidence of both their own and Oak's crimes was just the ironic cherry on top of this load of horseshit. Oak shuddered at the thought of what would happen if even one of the sicker inquisitors in the audience so much as looked at them, much less if the Lord Inquisitor himself started asking questions. So with that in mind, he decided it was time to move things along, nudging the restraint chair's testify rune with his chin. Inquisitor Oak cleared his throat, said a silent prayer to the Emperor, and launched straight into the formal wording of the right of counter-accusation. So no shit. Though we were the proverbial flies on the wall at the trial of Inquisitor Oak, in a lot of ways, it was a guardsman's dream come true. Watching our rear echelon so getting raked over the coals for all his bullshit. That's not to say we didn't silently support Oak with every ounce of self-preservation in our beings, but it sure was fun watching him squirm. Unfortunately, watching was definitely the word, because for some reason the fancy pants insisted on doing the whole damn thing in bloody high gothic. Amy, as the only one of us who spoke the frilly excuse for a language, was nominated as translator, but even her knobby knobbishness had trouble parsing high gothic legalese. Quickly growing bored with the markswoman's umming and erring, the rest of us surveyed the potential battlefield like good little guardsmen. The courtroom was a sort of massive amphitheatral, with the tiered seats split into raised platforms connected to a perimeter walkway. They had Oak up on a sort of brightly lit stage, strapped into this massive chair thing with rune-covered metal bands and the occasional decorative-looking spiky chain. Each of the 4 platforms, one for each Ordo Majoris and one for the Lord Inquisitor and his cronies, was screened off by weird blurry energy fields, as well as way more gothic fretwork than seemed reasonable, tasteful, or even sane. Tink, tilting his head as he looked upwards, pointed out that the blur fields were just there to keep the Inquisitors from seeing each other. The 4 terminally bored Deathwatch Marines standing around the upper perimeter could definitely see over them, which he was pretty sure was intentional. He was less certain about us being able to see up under the field's edges though, at least until Tact scared the shit out of us by cutting into our comms conversation to explain it was indeed intentional, since this was where he liked to watch from. Taking pity on Amy, the administrator took over translation duties. He kept the explanations short and pithy, but at least didn't bring out the sock puppets, muttering to us over some sort of augmetic throat microphone while maintaining his usual bland poker face. According to Tact, Oak's current speech was a legal motion to postpone his trial because some other Inquisitor was a far bigger heretic. Nubby noted that this option hadn't been made available in our trial, but that was probably for the best given the bored expressions we could see under the edges of the blur fields. Tact blandly explained that the official legal challenge had been invoked so often that it had passed into ritual millennia ago, losing all real meaning but none of the length. He assured us that the interesting bit would be at the end when he added the rarely used "and they're in this very room with us" part. On cue, the mood in the courtroom abruptly changed. The semi-visible audience sat up attentively, looking around their respective platforms and whispering excitedly to their neighbors, not to mention subtly checking the drawer of their assorted concealed weapons behind them, and feeling absolutely no need for subtlety. The 4 Deathwatch Marines readied their own weapons, curtailing most of the fidgeting up above us, taking the entire concept of subtlety and declaring it surplus to requirements and to be returned to stores. The Lord Inquisitor rose out of his seat, Sicker staff in hand, and instructed the Deathwatch captain behind him to shoot anyone who interrupted. Oak, grinning maniacally, started spilling the beans. All of the beans. Every demonic body swapping one of them. Now, we'd always been a bit iffy on Oak's inquisitorial credentials, him being a desk-riding, pencil-pushing, rear echelon munitorum fracker of the highest order, but that was before we watched him run rings around an entire courtroom of Inquisitors while chained to a bloody chair. Without any interruptions, Oak was free to do what he apparently did best, piss off other Inquisitors. Grinning smugly, the man began to air centuries worth of inquisitorial dirty laundry, assassinations, cover-ups, demon summonings, and a list of frack-ups so colossal that it dwarfed even ours. Oak laid it all bare for his ironically captive audience. Even with us relying on Administrator Tack's glib translation and Amy's reactions, Oak's speech was impressive, as well as oddly familiar. It wasn't just that we'd heard a good portion of it before, drunkenly delivered in an Arbeit's laundry brig during our one real conversation with our punitive superior officer. Rather, it was something in the delivery and structure of the arguments that reminded us of Sudge's failed diplomacy lessons with Tact, which raised certain questions. The elderly spy turned bureaucrat nodded proudly, assuring us that the little twerp had been even worse than that jackass Sisserstat, if we could believe it, but he'd been a good learner. There was no arguing that Oak had some real charisma. Nubby, as our resident expert on the subject, declared that he had it in spades, hearts, and possibly clubs. Charisma alone wasn't going to get him, or anyone else for that matter, out of an inquisitorial trial, which is why Oak had brought something even better. In a move worthy of bloody Castellan Creed himself, our Inquisitor started citing the previously submitted pieces of evidence in his own case, referencing sneakily inserted sections in the generally ignored appendices of several items. Oak wasn't referencing his own evidence, mind you, that'd be too obvious. The scheming bastard had actually managed to doctor the evidence submitted against him, a power move that spoke of mind-boggling levels of foresight, preparation, and deception. At least, that's what the inquisitorial audience and the Lord Inquisitor in particular seemed to think. Twitch confidently, and correctly, assured us that Tact and his bureaucratic minions had just done it all for him. Of course this revelation left Oak in a bit of a pickle, at least according to Tact, because suddenly there were a whole lot of very clever Inquisitors flipping through the rest of the notes on their data lecterns, checking to see what else was hidden there. This was presumably why Oak skipped straight to the demon is here, and I wanna summon it part, or demonum ad testimonium as he put it, doing a damn good job of projecting righteous fury for a guy locked to a chair. There was a brief silence, and then the inquisitorial audience lost their collective shit. Back in the Guard, we'd have never imagined that there was more than one possible answer to hey, let's summon a demon, much less 27 separate, utterly self-confident and increasingly shouty ones. It didn't take a genius to see what was coming next, and the Deathwatch Marine ushers seemed to be anticipating the show just as much as we were. At the 9-second mark the first punch was thrown somewhere up in the Hereticus seats, eliciting a round of cheering from the peanut gallery, which abruptly cut off as a wave of psychic silence rolled out from the Lord Inquisitor's staff. These being Inquisitors, it took a little more than a psychic shushing to restore order, which is why, after the third psychic blast, the Deathwatch captain ordered his marines in to break things up. Amazingly, this wasn't the end of things, and after a seventh psychic blast, the Lord Inquisitor angrily turned to the room's control servitor and ordered it to deactivate the blur fields and bring on the seat lights. Realizing they were on display to the other Audace, most of the Inquisitors froze mid-disagreement, leaving a pair of elderly Hereticus Inquisitors throwing insults and decorative items at each other around an interposed Deathwatch Marine, and an especially vocal Audace Xenos Inquisitor suspended from the fist of his platform's Marine. The Audomalius platform did not need any help from its assigned Deathwatch Marine, because the Audomalius platform contained only 2 Inquisitors, with the rest of the space being taken up by 4 grey armored space marines and a large reliquary. Some sharp words from the Lord Inquisitor put an end to the scuffle, and after 2 more psychic blasts, the suspended Xenos Inquisitor finally ended his rant with a resounding Tau Delenda estate and demanded to be placed back down. Order finally restored. The Lord Inquisitor gave Oak a long, exasperated look, before his curiosity got the better of him and he asked Oak how he intended to do it. Next to us, Tact quietly chuckled, assuring us all that Oak had this because, as he put it, if there is one thing that boy is good at, it's convincing supposedly rational and intelligent people to do something monumentally stupid. Tact was right, as usual. In a surprisingly short time, the Lord Inquisitor had Oak explaining his summoning procedure in plain, old-fashioned gothic or as close as one can get while talking about induced xanthistic autosynthesis and nominative materialism. They even let him out of the chair, which is to say the Lord Inquisitor and the 2 Audomalius Inquisitors decided to let him out, the rest of the audience not being invited to either vote or comment. This did not sit well with several of the other Inquisitors, but since they didn't have a psychic staff of silence or their own cadre of space marines, their opinions didn't carry any real weight. The straps and chains having been remotely released, Oak was free to pace around the platform, stretching his limbs, and triumphantly monologuing about his brilliant plan to foil what he believed to be a greater demon of Tsinch. At the Lord Inquisitor's instruction, we were waved forward to lug the 3 boxes over to the stage, passing them through the briefly lowered energy field that constituted the real security here. The second that the boxes were through and the field was back up, Oak's demeanor changed. It wasn't a big change, just a relaxation in the poker face he was maintaining, but we weren't the only ones to notice it. A murmur passed through the audience as the Inquisitors quietly asked each other what was so important about the 3 belatedly delivered evidence boxes. But before the Lord Inquisitor could shush them, Oak announced he was ready to summon the demon right now. Oak's announcement was a surprise, us being under the perfectly reasonable impression that summoning a demon took a bit more setup and effort. We'd expected a bunch of runes and geometric lines drawn in blood, or at least red chalk and maybe some ritual chanting and a bunch of dribbly candles. At the very least, We'd expected a sicker, Oak not being one despite rumors to the contrary, and we certainly weren't alone in that assumption judging by the shocked expressions on several of the Inquisitors' faces. The Lord Inquisitor, realizing that he'd lost all control over the situation and looking none too happy about it, grumpily ordered Oak to get on with it. There was at least a little bit of ritual involved, if only in the sense that Oak had obviously spent way too much time practicing his speech in the shower. Monologuing in his best orator voice, Oak strolled around the boxes reintroducing the 3 dead Inquisitors whose skulls he'd acquired, and who he'd just previously accused of demonic possession, much to the scandalization of the audience. Some of the Inquisitors were more than scandalized though. There was a definite undercurrent by the Emperor. This might actually work, especially from the 2 Malleus Inquisitors and their squad of grey armored space marines. Playing his audience like a marketplace charlatan, Oak advised that everyone, not just the space marines, get their weapons ready and place their bets on which of their colleagues it was going to be. The Lord Inquisitor bellowed at him to stop showing off and just do it, and Oak pushed the little hidden button on the first box's latch. Inside the masterfully crafted facsimile of an inquisitorial evidence box, a tiny Vox transmitter verified the presence and readiness of its sibling units, and then activated the Xeno spiritual warp battery. The warp battery consisting of a delicate wafer of intricately worked wraith bone, an elder soul gem, and a small shaped explosive charge flooded with psychic energy as the soul gem was shattered. The soul of the elder Bonasina occupying the gem was understandably distressed at its predicament, and fled outwards through the wraithbone circuitry towards the one minuscule sliver of hope left to it, the oddly green chips of soulstone embedded in the skull latch's eyes. Psychic energy poured into the skull of the long dead Inquisitor, branching through the delicately carved Finrisian runes covering its interior. The spell had been hand-carved, literally, like with his fingernails, by a ex-Deathwatch rune priest of Oak's personal acquaintance in exchange for a veritable trove of Space Wolf war gear recovered from a renegade Blood Raven's strike cruiser during the Aurelian Purge. Essentially, it was an old Finrisian spell, used for millennia by both the vengeful and the boastful to summon the shade of the slain to name the one who slew them. Where it got interesting was what happened when the answer was well, technically it was that Inquisitor over there on that box next to me. From the outside there wasn't much to see. First one chest started glowing with eldritch energy, then the one next to it, and then the third. This was followed by an awkwardly long wait, with Oak glaring daggers at the glowing boxes and making a just a few more seconds gesture. Then, as the audience started getting antsy and the first calls for Oak's execution began to ring out, a small dumpy Inquisitor in the Audace Xenos section erupted in pink feathers. The situation was evolving quickly, quite literally in the case of the patently possessed pink Inquisitor, whose colorful feathers were followed by the abrupt elongation of their everything. The humanoid form stretched upwards into something massive and avian, its head splitting apart into 2 writhing necks and wings sprouting from its back, almost faster than the eye could see. Of course, almost didn't really cut it where either Space Marines or Inquisitors were concerned, or us for that matter. A torrent of bolter, LAS, melter, plasma, and totally not pulse rifle fire slammed into the emerging demon, reducing its corporeal form to an iridescent pink mist, along with 3 adjacent Inquisitors and a decent portion of the platform. Even that wasn't enough though, showing a resilience that dwarfed even the demonthrope. The aerosolized demon started persistently reforming around the incoming projectiles. The brief stalemate ended as the Audace Malleus came into play, the 2 Inquisitors chanting some unintelligible litany and waving their staffs, while the 4 Space Marines in the ornate grey armor jumped the considerable gap between the platforms and activated their force weapons. As the Space Marines closed on the thing, the diffuse cloud of projectile-ridden demon stuff attempted to shy away, but an invisible force held it pinned. Actually, the force had it more than pinned, it was inexorably dragging the thing forwards, onto the blades of the Sicarus starts, and then even further towards the center stage. Oak watched triumphantly as minced demonic matter flowed through the energy field protecting him and poured down into the open mouth of the first box. The flow grew to a torrent as the Marines started chopping away bigger and bigger chunks. And then, very abruptly, it was over. The last remnants of the demon, losing all cohesion, were sucked into the box with a distinctly slurp-like sound. The lid closed with an impressive slam, followed almost instantaneously by 2 more as the first box was drawn into the second, and then into the third like one of those Vostroyan nesting dolls. The solitary remaining chest sat still and pulsed with a steady, barely pink psychic glow. Oak, having prudently taken cover behind the restraint chair as the torrent of demon stuff poured in, stepped out and surveyed the situation with an air of smug satisfaction. Then, I shit you not, everyone started clapping. The 2 Malleus Inquisitors were the ones who started it, but the attitude was downright infectious, and claps and cheers started ringing out from all sides, with even one of the Deathwatch Marines joining in. Oak, unable to resist being an overdramatic prat, stood there in the middle of the stage and started bowing to the crowd like a bloody stage magician after an exceptionally clever trick. Credit where it was due, it had been a greater demon of scene she'd pulled out of an audience member's ear. And even we were clapping and cheering. But then again we were idiots, not a bunch of fracking Inquisitors. And Oak had even less of an excuse than all of them, since he still had a job to do. Several of them in fact, starting with the final step of his demon capturing plan, activating the fracking tesseract. Unfortunately, in so many ways, before Oak could finish his grandstanding and get around to doing his damn job, the Ordo Malleus decided to do it for him. Declaring time to be of the essence, one of the Malleus Inquisitors jumped down to the floor, directing his Greysicker Marines minions to bring forward a massive, ornately decorated reliquary. The other Malleus Inquisitor requested that the Lord Inquisitor lower the energy field so the knights could perform their rite of sealing and that Oak please back away. We never seen Inquisitor Oak differ before, but it was definitely happening now. As Tact explained it, Oak had a simple choice. He could insist his demon trap was good enough, admitting in the process that he'd misappropriated a Tesseract labyrinth, figured out how to make it work, and smuggled it into Inquisitorial headquarters. Or he could sprint for the box, hit the button, and try to come up with a believable explanation on the spot, under the scrutiny of a bunch of sickers and an audience still full of traitors. Or he could, you know, keep his mouth shut and just let the Ordo Malleus have the damn thing without revealing anything self-incriminating at all. Needless to say, he chose the latter. The consequences of Oak's weasliness became apparent as the Grey Knights finished their ritual, and a flash of green light, which even we could recognize as Necron Y, sucked the whole box into the reliquary. The Malleus Inquisitor, looking very pleased with himself, announced that they had a long trip to Titan and needed to get going before the Tyrannid splinter fleet got any closer. Up on their platform, the sole remaining Malleus Inquisitor assured him that she'd handle the rest of the trial, and he really should get going immediately. Oak, whose plan involved keeping the demon locked in the courtroom until his evidence had been fully heard and a plan of action had been formed, abruptly shifted into damage control mode. He was already too late. Oak did his best to stop the Grey Knights leaving with the box, arguing that it would tip off the conspiracy, and that the Tyrannids weren't that imminent a threat. When that didn't work, he switched to trying to convince the court into immediate action, initiating a full purge of Inquisitorial headquarters alongside the Knights' exit. Unfortunately, this led to the questions of targets, priorities, who could be trusted, and whether Oak really expected them to just take his word on it instead of looking at the evidence themselves. Rather desperately, Oak shifted from asking for a purge to merely requesting a lockdown of the whole facility by trustworthy non-inquisitorial forces, such as the Mustering Guard Task Force in orbit. The Lord Inquisitor asked if he meant the Guard Task Force commanded by the same Lady General von Humperdinck whose daughter Oak held hostage. Ignoring the outraged sputtering from both the audience and Amy, Oak soldiered on, insisting that Amelia von Humperdinck had actually been apprehended by the Inquisition along with the majority of his teams. The Lord Inquisitor paused, visibly pondering whether he'd accidentally executed the daughter of the system's de facto military commander, before Tact cleared his throat, more surprised than offended. as if a chair or desk had suddenly offered its expert opinion on the matter at hand. The Lord Inquisitor nodded to Administrator Tact, playing the pedantic bureaucrat with every ounce of his being. Tact explained that the heiress in question had received a commuted sentence, merely having been transferred to the Inquisitorial Penal Legion, the one which had just shipped out to serve as tyrannid fodder. This time it wasn't just the Lord Inquisitor who paused, the entire audience was taking a moment to ponder the options for indiscriminate retribution available to a vengeful Lady General. Tact let the moment drag out, just in case Oak wanted to explain why the situation really wasn't as bad as it sounded. Oak, sporting the look of a man who had absolutely no intention of admitting he'd managed to fake a whole tyrannid incursion, kept his mouth shut, with a curse only we could hear. Tact blithely continued, assuring the Lord Inquisitor that it had all been taken care of, the young lady having been picked up shortly after deployment by their mutual cousin. The Lord Inquisitor stared back blankly, until Tact added, "You know, large mustache, has a sicker butler, insists everyone call him the Rupert." Nodding in sudden recognition, the Lord Inquisitor turned back to Oak and informed him that the answer was still no. The same went for the rest of Oak's suggestions. Note to the Lamenter Space Marines, who he'd gifted a large cache of genocides captured from an Alpha Marine recruitment base. Note to the Mechanicus Skiterii, who were here to pick up the heretic he'd been hiding. Again. And note to the several ships full of Arbites, sent here in force on the orders of his protege Inquisitor Cicertut. Even his final suggestion, having the local Deathwatch contingent handle it all themselves, was shot down, though that last one had more to do with the Deathwatch captain wanting no part of the shitshow, and suggesting an orbital bombardment instead. Thoroughly outfoxed, and desperately trying not to look like it, Inquisitor Oak watched the squad of Grey Knights as they hefted their reliquary and headed for the service door. The Lord Inquisitor returned to his seat, ordering Tact, which is to say us, to clean up the worst of the mess. As we got the scattered mess of evidence boxes back into their assigned spots, what was left of the inquisitorial audience tried to find seats without too much blood and or bullet holes and sat back down. Oak reluctantly got back into his seat too, shooting the occasional glance from Tact to us, to the door the Space Marines had gone through, back to Tact, and so on, doing his best to ignore the blatant signaling. The administrator diffidently pointed out that the Lord Inquisitor had quite a bit on his schedule, and asked if he should discreetly postpone things until their deliberations were finished. After a thoughtful pause, the Lord Inquisitor nodded, and sent him off to handle things in his absence, adding a casual instruction to take his escort along and have us mind-wiped and assigned to militia service. As the service door shut behind us, Tact let out a long, frustrated breath, declared Oak to be a self-serving little shit weasel, and yelled at us to get moving before those militia frackwits screwed everything up. The change in mood was sudden, but unsurprising. Even if we didn't know exactly how or why, we always expected someone to frack up. It was one of the tenets of Murphus. So, as proper guardsmen, we were preparing for shit to hit the fan before we even stepped off the shuttle. We double timed it to the exit, Tact jogging along at the rear, only to slow down as the void shield loomed. The elderly administrator elbowed past us to a small control lectern, cursing under his breath the entire time. Sarge rather curtly told the man to stop bitching and start briefing. Tact gave him a withering look and explained that we'd just entrusted a greater demon of Tsinch to a bunch of sickers for transport. The chances of them fracking this all up were beyond certain. On cue, he deactivated the void shield, revealing a massive jagged hole where that vault door had been. The Deathwatch Marines who'd been supermanning the post were notably absent, but at least we found the door. It was slumped against the far wall where the impatient Space Marine sickers had yoted when nobody had answered their polite knocking. It was impressive as hell. Not a broken door, mind you. Anyone can break a door, but it takes a damn professional to frack up their mission before even making it past the first checkpoint. We would know. Nubby and Doc whistled appreciatively. Amy swore, and Twitch started cackling maniacally. While Tink sent out a ping to spot 3.0, Sudge grabbed the spy formerly known as Diplomacy Adept by the back of his robe and broke into a sprint. Rather embarrassingly, Sudge had to immediately stop and turn around so Tact could turn the void shield back on. It was definitely worth the short backtrack though, since judging by the muffled shouting and bolt of fire, the Inquisitors were busy with their deliberations and wouldn't want any interruptions. Tact took a break from cursing Oak's name to proudly declare that between the enemy's stacking of the court and his own gracious assistance with their efforts, nearly a third of the Inquisitors still lived there were conspiracy agents, hence the Space Marine ushers. Unfortunately, the same ratio held true for the giant mob of inquisitorial agents the Grey Knights were about to march out into with their demon box. As guardsmen, we generally approved of the good old get all your enemies in one place and then shoot them maneuver, but thinking back to that small army of inquisitorial minions we'd passed through on the way in, Oak and Tact had definitely overdone it. There was also the rather pressing question of why in the Emperor's name neither one of them had told anyone at all, about their genius master plan to invite all their enemies here at once. That, Tact informed us, had been Oak's job, hence the preemptive pardon, and the Archaeotech energy shield protecting him from the audience, and the inquisitorial fracking rosette he was so fracking proud of. But no, instead of coming clean and taking his lumps, he chickened out and now we were stuck cleaning up his mess all because that slimy little weasel wanted to keep his fracking job. Sudge nodded as he picked Tact back up and asked why he hadn't said anything, and blow my cover frack off. Tink interrupted Tact's tirade to inform us that Spot should have seen what had happened to the Deathwatch Marines, and he was pulling the vid now. Tink's run slowed to a jog, then a walk as he poked at his data slot with increasing annoyance. Finally the techie shrugged and clarified that he actually had no idea what happened to the Deathwatch Marines, since the first one never came back, and the other just sort of stepped into a shadow and vanished. Just poof. Gone. Tink asked if that was, like, a Deathwatch thing. Only for Tact to snap that no, it wasn't, because that was an Alpha Marine infiltrator. The administrator's bombshell didn't hit quite how he expected. Nubby asked if he meant like one of them baby Marines with dar fancy stealth cloaks and sniper rifles. Only for Amy to point out that this one had power armor and a bolter, and it wasn't even a stalker pattern. Tact told both of them to shut up, looked around at the rest of us in bafflement, before slowly explaining that an Alpha Marine was a Chaos Space Marine. We'd, killed one. Remember there was a thoughtful pause, and then Sarge asked if he meant the pointy blue-green one or the spiky black-yellow ones, and more importantly, did he mean infiltrator in the tactical sense or? Twitch answered before Tact, explaining that just like Hook Commanders the greenish Chaos Marines could disguise themselves as Deathwatch Marines, lying in wait with nobody the wiser until it was time to strike. Tact stared blankly for a second, started to say something, and then sighed and admitted that Twitch was pretty much right. With a triumphant shout of "I knew it," the demolitions trooper started pulling crack nades from his pack and handing them out. The point which we were so aggressively missing was that the Grey Knights and their chump of a boss were walking straight into not one, but two ambushes. On the bright side, though, it looked like they weren't completely clueless, since according to the note pinned to the passageway's middle door, they'd commandeered the entire band of sisters guarding it. Tact paused for a second to boggle at the note, which declared that the sisters were escorting a squad of Grey Knights and their containment reliquary to their shuttle, back in 30, and asked if one of us had written it. Sarge pointed out that we'd have just called the thing a demon box and the spelling was too good, and then picked the grumpy old man back up before he could start complaining about youth these days and their lack of operational security. Someone else was taking OPSEC seriously, though, because there was something wrong with our comms. Well, not our comms. As Tink immediately pointed out, it was Tact who said he was having a problem reaching anyone, except for us of course. Tink, not having any idea how to mess with Tact's internal spyvox thing, started flipping his own comb bead through channels and slowed to a walk while he poked at his data slot. Everyone turned to look at the techie as he triumphantly announced that our comms were all fine. It was the headquarters network that was fracked to hell. It wasn't down exactly, and it hadn't locked us out. It just didn't seem to be passing along any of our messages. There was definitely other traffic though, a lot of it. Belatedly recognizing the looks of horror on Sarge, Doc, and Tack's faces, Tink announced it was probably time to give Jim and Hannah a call. Enginseer Jimothy flinched in embarrassment as the blare of a TAU military-grade Vox signal, tuned to max anti-jamming no less, cut through the data cant of the choir. Jim's sense of shame was a tired, vestigial thing, though, worn down by life, Guardsmen, demonic incursions, Guardsmen, and his unasked-for credentials as a cadet member of the Audace Juris. Hannah's, on the other Mecha Dendrite, was non-existent. Before Jim could say anything, or she'd even decrypted the signal, the Enginseer rounded on the assembled senior tech priests and unleashed a verbal reaming that would have done Inquisitor Sergeant proud. When he'd first arrived, the local priesthood had been surprisingly cooperative. This had less to do with any personal respect for the two low-level Ordo Juris acolytes, and more to do with the creepily smiling hologram of the Magos Juris currently commanding the fleet in orbit. That and the cadre of combat Enginseers that constituted the delegation from the Palladian 257th. The revelation that Oak's contact was the same Magos Juris that had inducted Jim and Hannah wasn't a surprise. Exactly, since Jim and Hannah had both been fervently praying to the Omniscient that this was the case ever since they'd seen the familiar arc at the center of the Mechanicus fleet. The combat Enginseers were a surprise though, and Jim let out a panicked blurt of binary as the heavily armed tech priests and their even more heavily armed servitors trooped out en masse in response to his signal at Vehicle Bay I-9's service entrance. Even more surprising than their overarmed escort was the presence of a worryingly familiar looking oversized servo skull accompanying them. Hannah sent a panicked signal to Theo, who reassured her that the Mago was definitely still aboard and currently pontificating on the difference between a Mork host and a Gork host. The servo skull also reassured her that any resemblance to heretics living or dead was purely coincidental, and it was merely a well-disguised Archaeotech data relay of staggering bandwidth and fidelity. This did not reassure either Hannah or Jim, which given the Magos Juris in question, was presumably the point. Backed up by their Magos authorization codes, Jim and Hannah had no problem walking straight into the facility's primary data node and announcing an immediate security audit. In fact, several of the resident tech priests seemed downright giddy at the prospect, which made sense after Jim saw what centuries of credential management via inquisitorial fiat had done to the security system's machine spirit. Hannah took one look at the opaque, twisted mass of a machine spirit, and declared it to be exactly the sort of security system that a current border would have, if it had one at all. That is, the tech priests summoned in from the inquisitorial retinues were less cooperative. For the most part they grudgingly submitted to the Magos Juris authorization codes, albeit with a lot of nihil-heretical complaining. The 6 tech priests who refused to recognize Jim, Hannah, or the tele-present Magos as legitimate representatives of the Ordo Juris, or the Ordo Juris as legitimate itself, were informed that their objections were noted, before being forcibly subdued and integrated into the data choir by a bunch of unamused combat Enginseers. The other 3 objectors had expressed their opinion via a barrage of warp-infused scrap code, which would have been very effective if standard Enginseer protocol, in both the guard and on the occurrence border, didn't include turning off all Nuspheric and Vox data connections. Once the crater where the 3 heretics had been standing stopped smoking, the conclave of disaster recovery commenced. They had been 2 hours into the litany of safe shutdown, with 7 still to go, when Tink's signal brought an end to the farce. Hannah's rant was interrupted by the Magos Juris redirecting full control of the assembled data choir to her. There was a brief pause as the Enginseeress attempted to parse the sudden deluge of data, and then she found what she was looking for. The assembled tech priesthood swore and held onto their augmetic butts as Hannah ordered the entire power distribution system into full emergency purge and shutdown. Without incense, Tink swore and stumbled as Jim's transmission came in and informed everyone present that the entire everything was going to be experiencing technical difficulties shortly. Sarge swore and dropped to the rear next to Nubby and readied the administrator for detachment. With Twitch and Amy on point, we jogged through the door into the hollow hall just in time to see Mr. Professional Demon Wrangler Malleus Inquisitor Badass explode. Well, not actually CC, what with all the Malleus stormtroopers and space marines between us and the blast, which was actually more of a wet pop. Spot had a great view, though, and caught a nice clear pic of the Inquisitor going off like a balloon full of viscera, pink fire, and demons. Why exactly this happened was unclear, but even Malleus Inquisitors, who are famously prone to this sort of thing, don't just randomly explode. Our money was on the little scroll he'd just been handed by that Ordo Xenos interrogator. That and his own untouchable interrogator deactivating his limiter with a triumphant cackle. The traitorous untouchable had roughly half a second to revel in his betrayal before the blast wave of flaming Inquisitor bits slapped the smug look off his face. The Xenos interrogator did better, ducking behind his companion and merely catching an artistic splash of pink fire across his forehead. The 4 space marines, on the other hand, didn't even try to dodge, stomping forward through the wave of liquid fire and slicing the newly manifested demon, a sort of living fire thing, to shreds with their force weapons. As badass as the space marines' immediate counterattack was, the short-lived fire demon had already done its job. The iridescent flames clinging to the 4 marines erupted like flares as they attacked with their psychic weapons, and the Xenos interrogator cackled triumphantly as he unleashed a psychic shriek that signaled the start of the ambush. The ambush, the first one at least, was both well planned and professionally executed. All across the massive hollow hall, traitorous Inquisition agents leapt into violent action, and not just against the space marines. Every single retinue seemed to have been infiltrated in one way or another, and it didn't take much for the embedded conspiracy agents to goad their comrades' paranoia and grudges into fratricidal violence. Entire retinues opened fire on each other, cyclic attacks of every sort were unleashed, and combat servitors and cyber mastiffs were unleashed more literally, in a frenzy of betrayal, violence, and stupidity worthy of an orc diplomatic summit. The entire place devolved into utter chaos. Under the cover of the massive bloodbath, the conspiracy's heavies made their move on the space marines, and the critical flaw in their plan became apparent. You see, instead of exploding the entire damn convoy with, say, Twitch's body weight and good old-fashioned high explosives, they decided to get fancy. So instead of having their smoking remains scattered across a half-kilometer radius, the 4 psychic space marines had merely been doused with Inquisitor-flavored warp fire. It was admittedly a very fancy variety of warp fire, one that fed off the Grey Knight's own psychic powers. At least judging by the way one of the marines erupted like a bonfire as he threw up a massive psychic shield over their position. A conventionally exploded psychic space marine would not have been able to project such a shield though, and the conspiracy's opening barrage of cyclic attacks and exotic ranged weaponry would have actually done something, assuming it would have been necessary at all. Just saying. At this point, Administrator Tact cut in to ask if we were going to do anything in unison. Every single red-blooded, emperor-fearing, heresy not committing one of us rounded on the little shit with a unanimous whisper of expletive no, as if to punctuate the point. A massive power surge radiated through the, well, everything. Vox systems shorted in showers of sparks. The massive door jamb we were all heroically hiding behind made an ominous clunking sound, and every single light in the room went out. Nubby gestured at the massive cavern, illuminated only by the flickering hollow statues and the sheer mass of weapons fire, and invited the former diplomacy adept to show us how it's done. The man had a point, though. We really did need to do something, and just as soon as we figured out what in the Emperor's name that was, we would get around to it. Amy was looking between her pulse rifle scope and Spot's video feed, trying to figure out if she could land hits on the rapidly moving targets, and whether Spot's marker thingy would help enough for the rest of us to assist. Twitch argued that this was a waste of time and effort, and that we should just go with the tried and true blow spot up again plan, on the theory that the Space Marine's psychic shield thing would probably be enough to handle a medium-sized explosion. Sarge was keeping his attention focused entirely on the box while debating with Doc whether or not the Xenos interrogator was a demon host. Not that there was much to debate, what with him holding up in melee combat with 3 Space Marines. That and the feathers and tentacles. Nubby, for his part, spent several enjoyable seconds pointing out the most interesting features of the ambush. There was the jetpack wearing rattling zooming around the hollow statues, the Ogryn preacher with a heavy flamer completely forgetting the words to a battle hymn but doing a good job on the tune, and the missing Sororitas contingent being torn apart by 3 dreadnought-like war machines. With the lights out, there wasn't much to see, though, so the little trooper keyed his comb bead to see how Fumbles was doing. Fumbles' relieved answer was cut off by a yelp of pain and the curator is angrily demanding to know where Tact was and why he wasn't answering his comms. The elderly spy turned administrator jerked at his henchwoman's voice and immediately started exchanging a barrage of gibberish with her. The incomprehensible conversation went on for several seconds, all of us wisely keeping our mouths shut until Tact abruptly cut off and turned to Tink before unleashing an equally unintelligible barrage of technobabble. Over the course of the next few seconds, dozens of separate, wildly incompatible inquisitorial comb networks were patched into SpotNet. As Tink made the final connection and Spot whined in mechanical protest, the elderly spy administrator began speaking in an entirely different voice, one we all recognized from the trial. In the booming voice of the Lord Inquisitor, Tact ordered all listening agents to engage Omega Protocol, and then immediately closed the channel and told Tink to turn all the networks off and start jamming before anyone could ask any questions or issue any orders of their own. We weren't sure what an Omega Protocol was, but a sort of order seemed to be coalescing in the maelstrom, with several groups of inquisitorial agents breaking off and running for the various exits. The main fight, however, continued unabated. The Space Marines were holding their own against the demonic interrogator and several of his allies, while their stormtrooper escort was having significantly less success. They were trying their best, but even before the conspiracy agents closed to melee, they'd been having a bit of trouble with their own interrogator. 2 of the slower stormtroopers had tried to help their interrogator, trying to beat out the living flames that covered him, only to reel backwards, the flames roiling up their arms, twisting and mutating them wildly as they flailed backwards in horror. Their more clever comrades opened fire on all 3 of them, a barrage of Helgen rounds putting down the 2 mutating troopers but doing nothing to the living candle that was the interrogator. Completely ignoring the LAS fire, the untouchable interrogator writhed around, casting little droplets of flaming interrogator tallow that brought down 2 other stormtroopers before a burst of bolter shells finally tore him to pieces. While this did solve the immediate problem, it went rather poorly for the nearest 5 or 6 stormtroopers and forced the survivors away from the steadily growing lake of mutagenic fire. Now it was just the 3 Space Marines unless you count the 4th one fully engulfed in warp fire against the demonic interrogator with about half of the ambush forced to back him up. At once, the surviving heretics fell on the Space Marines as their demonic leader vanished in a puff of smoke, only to reappear several seconds later behind the Space Marines, standing over the box. Sarge swore, ordering the rest of us to get ready as he watched the demonic interrogator on Tink's data slot. The demonic interrogator plunged a clawed finger into the burning rune on his forehead, quickly withdrawing it and drawing a matching rune on the adamantium surface of the reliquary. With a triumphant shriek from the beak-like beak thing, he leapt backwards, and in a piercing cry that radiated through our very souls, screeched he comes. For a split second the fighting stopped, everyone's attention on the interrogator as he stood, wings spread over the box, and absolutely nothing happened. The interrogator let out a little squawk of dismay as 3 different storm bolters blasted him to pieces, which evaporated out of the air. Tack looked to the rest of us and commented that, though Margot Smith was certainly insane, he did excellent work. Rather than break out the death of their leader, The conspiracy agents redoubled their assault, bringing down another of the Marines and forcing the remaining two back to back over the box. It was at this point, as the Grey Knights made their last stand, that the second ambush started. The second ambush was not well planned, because the second ambush did not need to be well planned, because the second ambush consisted of 3 squads of centuries-old genetically enhanced power-armored super warriors, and also a dreadnought. Instead of bothering with subterfuge or misdirection, the 3+ squads of Death Watcher strode through the room in a wave of indiscriminate violence that warmed our guardsmanly hearts. Bolter shells and more exotic weapons cut down dozens of Inquisition agents of indeterminate allegiance, while other Marines armed with chainswords or power weapons carved bloody swathes through anyone dumb enough not to run for it. Sarge let out a long breath and stood everyone back down, not that we needed telling, and returned to watching the besieged reliquary while Nubby solicited the rest of us to place our bets on how many of them were Alpha Marines. The bets were 9, 9, 9, all of them, and somewhere between 8 and 10 with an 11% error margin. Unfortunately for Tact, his bet was rejected on the grounds that it was his fault all of these Marines were here in the first place. The fact that his bet was the same as everyone else's was not seen as a factor, things being more or less at par. The real betting was on whether the Dreadnought was an Alpha Marine too, or possibly a cleverly disguised Orc Warbus, at which point the Curatorist cut in again, saying that she damn well hoped the big guy wasn't an Alpha Marine, because it was his giant Ceramitas that was covering their approach. The phrase covering our approach needed a little explaining. For instance, the covering didn't involve any actual covering fire. In fact, the massive yellow and black war machine didn't appear to have any ranged weapons at all, just a pair of stubby clawed arms with attached flamers. Instead, the big guy just stomped straight across the room, cutting right through the hectic maelstrom of violence, secure in the knowledge that nobody still alive at this point would be dumb enough to get in the way of a frackin' dreadnought. Somewhere behind the big stompy war machine, packed tightly into the bubble of invisibility Fumbles was straining to keep projected. The Curatorist followed, backed up by the nice young space marine from the door and his friends from the medbay. Mind you, they didn't have an actual plan either. The Curatorist described their general strategy as get as close as possible before the sudden but inevitable betrayal, and then wing it. This was rather embarrassing, since not only was it the exact same plan as ours, but they had started it first. Not to be outdone by a bunch of NGPS, non-guard personnel, Sarge gave the order to move out. The Dreadnought and its invisible escort were coming in from our 3 o'clock, which Tact claimed was the tunnel leading to the motor pool and recommended as our best line of retreat, assuming we managed to grab the box ourselves. There was quite a bit of hollow hole between us and them, but the Deathwatch Marines had done an admirable job of killing everyone too dumb or heretical to follow Tact's orders to withdraw, so it was more or less clear as long as we stayed away from the scrum over the damn box. Sarge grabbed Tact again, gestured at Nubby to lead the way, and as a unit we once again began the process of sidling around a complete Charlie Foxtrot that was technically not our problem. Actually, whatever the opposite of technically is, that, per Sarge's orders. As we moved, Tink kept an eye, or a spot, on the reliquary and the ongoing dispute over its ownership. The 2 Grey Knights, once again not counting the giant pillar of fire keeping the flickering psychic shield erected, were on their last legs. The conspiracy assault, despite the loss of their leader, comms, and lighting, not to mention everything else that had gone catastrophically wrong, was still pushing inwards. It was obviously a matter of moments before the 2 space marines fell and the question of the box's ownership became someone else's problem. But as the traitors made their final push, the Deathwatch assault caught up with them. A hail of bolter and plasma fire cut down the last of the conspiracy agents, leaving a single Grey Knight, an arm and half a leg completely encased with warp fire, standing victorious over his charge, at which point the 3rd ambush kicked off, in a repeat of the conspiracy's grand betrayal, between 8 and 10 space marines, with an 11% margin for error, suddenly, but inevitably, turned on their battle brothers. Nubby was instructed to stop trying to count who was on which side while Sarge did exactly that, except for far more valid staying alive reasons, and Tact badgered Tink to turn Spot's jamming as high as it would go. The frenzy of Space Marine on Space Marine violence stopped as quickly as it started, leaving 0 surviving Grey Knights, an indeterminate number of Deathwatch Alpha Marines scattered around the darkened room, and one dreadnought still slowly plodding towards the center of the room, seemingly oblivious to the bloodbath around it. There were several seconds of silence punctuated only by the sound of stomping footsteps and the occasional bolt of fire as the hidden Space Marines sniped at each other, and then a deep frustrated voice declared the Inquisitor inspects his closet for monsters, but not under his bed. Once again, there was a silence, and then another basso voice called out the commissar knows not how to hold a sword, only a whip. A third voice, startlingly close to our position, barked out it is Wednesday, my battle brothers, followed by several other shouts of incomprehensible gibberish. In the center of the room, a lone Deathwatch Marine stepped into the flickering light of the immolated Grey Knight and the still burning, and worryingly, twitching, remains of the untouchable. Removing his helmet, he incredulously asked if they were all Alpha Marines. After a brief pause, a second Marine stepped out and proclaimed he'd killed all of his assigned targets. One by one, a total of 9 Marines entered the light and declared their betrayals while spouting gibberish code phrases at one another. In a quiet voice, Nubby asked, who are at 9-3 Guardsmen, and Tact raised their hands. Nubby told Tact to frack off. Then a voice even deeper than the rest rang out, as am I. The 9 Space Marines spun around, briefly drawing aim on the dreadnought before registering its lack of ranged weapons. Not even missing a step, it continued, even in death, I still serve the ruinous powers. And a green multi-headed dragon sigil flickered into visibility on the war machine's chest. The helmetless Space Marine looked around in surprise, before shrugging and announcing that it did finally explain why the big guy was here instead of back with the scythes. Several of the other traitor Marines nodded in agreement and, as a group, moved to encircle the tainted reliquary and started quietly arguing with each other in some incomprehensible private language. Whatever the Alpha Marines were arguing about, presumably who was going to have to carry the still mutating reliquary, they didn't have time to reach a decision. There was a sudden, pained curse from Fumbles, and the advancing green sigil dreadnought flickered and vanished, revealing a tightly packed squad of Deathwatch Marines and an exhausted Seeker. All 9 Alpha Marines began to turn and bring their weapons to bear, only to realize that the actual dreadnought was just a little bit closer than it had appeared. With a massive, wall-shaking bellow of knot, the dreadnought sprinted across the last few meters, and several tons of pissed-off Astartes war machine smashed into the traitor Marines along with a volley of crack grenades. They weren't our grenades, even Sarge couldn't lob one that far. Our contribution consisted of a barrage of pulse rounds bursting through the hologram of a long-dead Inquisitor in an especially tasteless hat, all focused on a single point as designated by a TAU-ish marker light. The target of the barrage, the one jackass who still wasn't wearing his helmet, didn't even have time to react before his oversized skull exploded. Tink's overcharged plasma blast, moving slower than the pulse shots, sailed through the empty space where the traitor Marine's skull used to be, before continuing on to intercept a leaping conspiracy agent mid-sneak attack. Seizing the opportunity provided by the surprised dreadnought, the remaining traitorous inquisitorial agents launched a final desperate attempt to capture the reliquary. They were mostly ignored, the Alpha Marines opportunistically gunning them down as they dodged around the flailing dreadnought. The exception was the feathered pink form of the interrogator host. While its comrades rushed blindly into their deaths, the demonic interrogator hung back, arms and other appendages raised in a shrieking chant. Tink immediately shifted Spot's marker light to this new priority target, and our second volley tore into the mutated demon host's head torso region. That wasn't nearly enough to put the thing down, its flesh flowing back into the gaps like watery pudding, but we sure fracked up whatever spell it had been casting. A storm of pink and blue fire erupted out of the demon host with all the accuracy and control of an entire crate of bolter shells cooking off at once. The few remaining conspiracy ambushers were sprayed from behind with mutating fire, along with 2 of the Alpha Marines, the hollow statue between us, and a generous portion of the combat area. The spell fell far short of most of our allies' fumbles, and the Curator's squad of Deathwatch Marines having prudently held back from rushing in. The 2 non-space Marines were heroically cowering behind an overturned altar to some Inquisitorial saint, while the 4 loyal Deathwatch Marines had spread out to cover the Dreadnought's charge. The leader of the small squad, bearing a familiar apothecary kit and comet emblem, bellowed over our comb net for Sergeant Gravis to grab the damn box and get back here before he broke something. Sergeant Gravis did not appear to be listening, though, being far too busy flailing at the 3 Alpha Marines dancing outside of his reach. And it really was flailing, full of wild blows more appropriate for an orc warlord than the graceful space marine we remembered. Honestly, he was outclassed, and wouldn't have caught any of the 3 if it wasn't for the blast of warp fire raining around them. As one of his 3 targets, a power sword wielding marine with a red teardrop emblem, dodged away from an incoming fireball, Gravis lunged, snatching the marine out of midair with a triumphant bellow, and then staggering as a massive foot punched straight through the mass of flesh, tentacles, and flames that said fireball left on the floor. It had honestly never occurred to us that a dreadnought even could trip. The multi-ton Astartes war machine smashed forwards in a spray of sparks, blood, and warp fire, crushing the unfortunate Alpha Marine in his clutches and putting his one empty claw straight through the mutated metal of the box. This time, instead of a flash of necrotic light, the box released a massive pulse of psychic energy. The warp fire all around erupted upwards, and there was a triumphant screech from the demon host. He comes for real this time, the unknowing and unknown, the unseeing and unseen, the undoer and the undone. Now and the eternally surprised. There was an awkward pause as the demon host made a grandiose gesture in Gravis's general direction, and once again, nothing happened. Instead, the rising tide of warp energy abruptly stopped with a sudden psychic clang. There was a pause, and then the demon spoke. "Well, this is certainly unexpected." The voice was horrific. It was like someone had cobbled together the screaming of millions of tormented souls into a posh high gothic accent. It was like if the demon thrope could talk, was sentient, knew you personally, everything about you, and wanted to have a nice long chat and get to know you even better. It was also baffled, an emotion which didn't exactly mesh with the rest, but it couldn't be argued. Unknown, the greater demon of Tsinch, was baffled. The demon's power surged again, only to cut off with another psychic clang as it ran into whatever Oak had done to turn those 3 boxes into a demon trap. It didn't try a third time. I believe this calls for a change of plan. This time, there was something very different about the psychic power coming from the crushed reliquary. The warp flames illuminating the room abruptly began twisting, reaching out in 9 different directions centered around the twitching body of the somehow still alive untouchable. The twisting lines of warp energy seemed to pulse in time with the box, except for one, pointed more or less straight up, which was glowing with a worryingly familiar green and black tinge. It belatedly occurred to us that we should probably be doing something, as opposed to just letting the sorcery demon do all the sorcery, but by that point it was too late. With a psychic shockwave that put everything before it to shame, the demon shattered its own spell. Unknown had weaved the spell itself. No one else could have done it. 9 young seekers, their souls blessed and births foretold by the changer of ways, had been hunted down by the demon's pawns. The unstoppable force of their nascent gifts, blessings of magic and mutation beyond mortal comprehension or control, had been bound and balanced by an unmovable object of the demon's devising, an ungift. To create an untouchable was unthinkable, and therefore well within the purview of the demon's paradoxical powers, and such a walking warp void made the perfect linchpin for the spell. The hobbled humans, barely more powerful than the corpse god's blind servants, had been let loose. carefully mixed in with the other potentials. The 9 gifted had been rescued from a cabal of conspicuously incompetent rogue traders and inducted into the Inquisition without any extra effort on the demon's part. Unguided and untouched by the conspiracy, they had found their ways into various retinues, unknowingly bound to each other and the ungifted interrogator by their own powers. And then, with an eager chuckle, the demon snapped its creation and freed their gifts. Throughout the system, 8 young seekers blinked as a torrent of unimaginable power flowed into them. All suddenly became clear as the true glory of the changer of ways dawned upon them. Reality ceased to have meaning, time became a mere suggestion, and causality was discarded as an outdated concept in the face of the sheer overwhelming power of change. And then they all exploded into demons. Lots and lots of them, ignoring the newly formed warp portals. Unknown chuckled in amused surprise as a single remaining tendril of warp energy twisted around, unexpectedly unable to return to its source. With a metaphorical shrug, the demon redirected it into the nearest available receptacle, and the bird-like demon host shrieked as a 9th gateway into the crystalline labyrinth tore through its being. Of course, we didn't know any of that. All we knew was that somewhere off at the far ends of the room, 2 different seekers spontaneously exploded into warp portals full of capering blue and pink demonic horrors. We just thanked the Emperor that it hadn't been Fumbles who popped, and started a tactical withdrawal towards the vehicle bay. And that was before we saw the demon host explode into an even bigger 3rd warp portal. And that wasn't it, either. Just to make matters worse, the perpetually burning untouchable abruptly stopped being one. The burning wound suddenly erupted in a fountain of mutating meat and feathers, spewing forth unstoppably and flailing around like uncontrolled flesh fire hoses. Fire hoses, plural, 9 of them, of course, all weaving themselves into something between a chaos spawn and a really disgusting spaghetti dinner. On top of that, the arrival of 3 gaudily armored Chaos Marines stepping out of their respective portals was just excessive. So yeah, we felt pretty justified in our decision to tactically withdraw. And for once everyone seemed to agree with us on this, except for the Alpha Marines of course. With a simultaneous bellow of target acquired, the 3 surviving Alpha Marines as well as 2 of the ones we thought were dead, and another that we hadn't seen before all threw themselves at a single target. The Crimson and Blue Chaos Marine that had just emerged from the portal formerly known as Interrogator Host didn't even have time to raise his big eyeball staff, much less fight back. Then, just as abruptly, the Alpha Marines all vanished, some into clouds of smoke, some into puddles of shadow, and one who had presumably forgot his get out of Inquisitorial headquarters free spell who dove into a warp portal, triggered all of his grenades while screaming Hail Hydra. The non-traitor Marine's response was less enigmatic, bellowing at Gravis to get his ass up and bring back the damn box. The apothecary led the 4 Deathwatch Marines in a tactical advance, keeping a withering suppressive fire on both the warp portal and the rapidly growing untouchable spawn. With an incoherent bellow and a geyser of humorous fluids, the overturned dreadnought wrenched its leg free and levered itself upward, the jellied remains of the Alpha Marine squishing under claw. His other claw held the reliquary firmly. Was stuck inside it, and, like a concussed scramble player, Gravis clutched the flattened thing to his chest and lurched back towards his battle brothers. For our part, we raced ahead to the exit and the long-standing guard tradition of securing the line of retreat. Taking advantage of the extra breath supplied by his augmetic legs, Nubby announced that those of us who had put money on everything explodes into demons should contact him in 1 to 7 weeks about getting our winnings. Twitch's more specific bet of everything explodes into demons and orcs and demonids and more orcs and horrors dredged from the darkest recesses of our imaginings and more orcs was still not technically ruled out, but Nubby would need to see at least 6 orcs before he would entertain it. Sarge barked at the little trooper to cram it and redirected his charge toward where the elderly curatoress was attempting to drag a spasming, twitching Fumbles to safety before he also exploded. Dropping his pulse rifle to his side, and without breaking his stride, Sarge scooped the old lady under the arm, not holding tact. Behind him, Nubby and Twitch grabbed Fumbles and booked it off to Sarge while Tink, Amy and Doc began laying down covering fire on the mutated bat-like creatures flapping out of the portal. While our retreat was relatively unchallenged, Sergeant Gravis's was a different story. Tentacles of flesh and minor Tzeentchian horrors clawed at the Dreadnought's heels despite his battle brothers covering fire. The wild swings of Gravis's free claw cut bloody swathes through the demon tide, to no real practical effect. Bellowing in frustrated rage, the war machine abruptly stopped and clawed at the tangled mass of crushed metal stuck to its hand while the wave of enemies boiled around him. With a shriek of tearing metal, Gravis ripped the box free, along with a good portion of his hand, and then, I shit you not, he threw the damn thing right at us. The tangled mass of metal sailed through the air with all the grace and accuracy, not to mention mass and speed, of a high-speed motorcycle crash. To a guardsman, we dove for cover, the hurled chunk of metal howling overhead like an artillery shell, with Spot zipping along behind. It didn't hit any of us or the door for that matter, instead smashing into the nearby wall, leaving a massive crater and blasting 2 or 3 millennia of patina off the fresco commemorating the evolution of the Excruciator through the ages. Behind us, Sergeant Gravis let out a bellow of triumph. Handle it. As we hauled ourselves to our feet, the Dreadnought turned back to the fight, and apparently remembered that it had been equipped with actual weapons. There was an explosion of smoke and fire as 2 flamers, 2 chest-mounted heavy bolters, and 16 single-shot defensive smoke launchers fired at once. Even before it had been crushed, mangled, and mutated, transporting that damn adamantium reliquary would have been a tall order. Now, with it embedded a good half-meter into a wall, there was only one option. With a triumphant smirk, Tink fired up his techno-heretical plasma gun and set it to cut. Sarge hustled his payload of geriatric spies around the door jamb, the 2 of them still frantically babbling into their comb beads, seemingly completely disinterested in the current clusterfuck. Under the cover of the rest of the squad, except for Twitch who was too busy laying mines, Tink extracted a glowing mass of scrap metal which he was positive contained Oak's box. Somewhere. It was still a heavy and unwieldy thing, mind you, but it didn't seem to be doing anything especially warpy. Fumbles seemed to be recovering now that he had gotten away from the chaos portals. The problem of how to carry it, and the spies, and Fumbles, who could stand up but hadn't gotten to walking in a straight line just yet, was answered for us as a familiar electric tour train rocketed out of the nearest side door. The wheelchair-bound scribe, looking decidedly worse for wear and clutching a hand cannon as he steered, seemed to have a very clear picture of what was going on. Before the rest of us could even start moving, Tact, the curatoress, and the scribe already had their heads together speaking what was ostensibly low gothic, but with a speed and level of jargon that rendered it unintelligible. Following their lead and doing our best not to interrupt the 7 different conversations the 3 of them were having, we loaded up and sped off towards the motor pool, Twitch's mind's already going off behind us. The mission hadn't been so much overcome by events as it had been overcome by full-blown demonic incursion. In an attempt to establish just how fully it blew, Sludge put his foot down, not literally mind you, that being one of the 37 acts forbade to visitors while the conveyance was in motion, according to the little plaque. In the firm voice of patriarchal command, Sludge told the 3 elderly spies that if one of them didn't put their comms down and give us a briefing, he was going to have Tink turn off their Wi-Fi. This declaration earned Sludge an eye roll and a rude gesture from the curatoress as she continued her conversation, but Tact took the hint. There were, to the surprise of no one, 9 demonic portals currently open, 2 more having opened inside the headquarters complex, 1 in the live evidence storage building, C, prison, and another right on the main shuttle pad. Without a bunch of assortedly loyal space marines on the spot, these 2 portals had grown rapidly as the demons or chaos marines leading each force opened more and more gateways. The situation up in orbit was somehow even worse. 3 inquisitorial ships were fast on their way to becoming sentient space hulks, and as for the main orbital complex, Amy's mom had already given the order to break out the exterminatus grade munitions. That wasn't all that Amy's mom was doing, either. Abandoning all pretext of this not being totally premeditated, 5 regiments of guard were in the process of landing and setting up a cordon under command of Inquisitor General the Rupert. Oaks Mechanicus and Arbite allies were enforcing a cordon of their own, this time around the Inquisitorial fleet, which was undergoing a far more protracted and indiscriminate version of the Charlie Foxtrot in the Hollow Hall. The Space Marines were, of course, loading into drop pods and firing themselves straight down into the middle of the demonic incursion with every sign of enjoyment. The problem with Tact's brief was that none of this had anything to do with us getting one badly damaged demonic containment unit the hell out of here before it turned the entire place into a demon world. Tact nodded and explained that this was exactly why he hadn't been telling Sarge anything in the first place. In deference to Sarge's very unamused look, the former diplomacy adept went on to explain that what we were doing was heading towards the motor pool. From there, an armored transport would be made available to get us the frack out of there before any conspiracy reinforcements, demonic hordes, or random drop pods full of even more alpha marines could find us. Behind Sarge, Tink opined that what we really needed from the motor pool was a cogboy who knew how these spooky demon box things are supposed to work. Tink then brandished a black cube he just extracted from the metal mass, and declared that he was 90% sure this part was supposed to be inside at least one of the boxes. Everyone, including the curators and the scribe driver, turned to look at Tink, and reminded him that Margot Smith, unfortunately, existed. Tink blushed and activated his own comb bead. It took the Mad Margos all of 5 seconds to start screaming. Tink's insistence that he had installed the Tesseract correctly, and so there must be some entirely unrelated reason that it was currently outside the box, did not de-escalate the situation. With a berserk scream of outrage, the Margos announced it was time to activate Plan R, and ordered his TAU minion to ready the Xenophantasmal Warp Gemma. Tink's inquiry into just what the hell Smith was talking about and how it was supposed to help him get the doodad back in the stupid box was met with a piercing screech of Vox distorted cursing, with some swearing of his own. Tink decided to just call Theo instead. According to his TAU minion, the Mago was not actually screaming over his Vox unit, just over the ComNet, and actually it was just Tink's channel. His other conversations with the buyers were continuing uninterrupted, and Theo would be sure to let us know before they activated the warp translocator. Tink's incredulous buyers was cut off as Nubby broke into the channel and informed Theo that he'd better not be selling any of my stuff. Theo reassured him that it was just the Mago's own collection, you know, the Wit Boy, the Squig Stealers, the Demon Thrope. The choked silence was broken after a few seconds by Nubby asking how much they got for it, cause he knew a guy. Taking in the murderous look on Sarge's face, the cretinous little trooper broke off, whining that he wasn't the one selling it. Seemingly oblivious to all of this, Theo chatted on, assuring us that now that the warp translocator was functional, transferring the specimens would be quite easy, even with all the warp interference from the, you know, massive demonic incursion. Tinkendock, being slightly faster on the uptake, asked if Theo meant that Margot Smith had built a teleportarium. The Margos was apparently listening to this conversation as well, and graced us with an explanation. No, I found one downstairs, incorrectly labeled as full of bees. Tink, who had encountered and fled from said bees, began to argue only to be completely ignored, when upon even cursory analysis they are obviously a species of parasitic warp wasp. So you cleared them out? Then asked Sarge. No, of course not, you simpleton. I work around them, ignoring the typically off-topic conversation happening in the background. Theo readied himself at the control altar of the recently refurbished and de-wasped warp translocator. Overhead, the looming form of the Demon Thrope emitted a palpable and scientifically measurable aura of hatred and menace. The hatred was only reading 1/9th of an angron, so there was no risk of an imminent containment breach. Fortunately, zipping around overhead, the Mago began the pre-translocation checklist with a buyer's cogboy. The stasis field is ready, affirmative. The C suppressors, affirmative. The warp presence shroud, affirmative. And they are all inside the astropathic sanctum, affirmative. The beacon is active, and the voids have been lowered, and you're absolutely certain there's no such thing as a demonically possessed zoanthrope, and are therefore completely unprepared for the consequences of teleporting one through the warp. Interrogative. What excellent TAU minion. The lever Theo sighed with relief as, after so long, the demonthrope finally became someone else's problem. Aboard the Nemesis class battleship Zenodium that served as the unofficial and very secret flagship of a conspiracy-aligned fleet, Arch-Heretic Molder of the Dark Mechanicum looked up in shock as something far more interesting than a mere zoanthrope materialized in front of him. His augmetic brain raced to catalog his observations, sending each fascinating datum off for secure off-site storage even as the rest of his physical form erupted in a sudden tide of chittering insects. The heretic's short-lived Beneric scream went entirely unnoticed, completely drowned out by the triumphant psychic shriek of the free demonthrope. Even with Tink's hasty warning and his lead-line guard issue flak helmet, Fumbles still flopped around like an electrocuted fish as the demonthrope commenced its quote-unquote warp jamming. The rest of us had become so used to this that it barely even merited a flinch. The exceptions being the curatoress and the driver scribe, until Tact casually reassured that it was just a demonically possessed zoanthrope from the lump of twisted metal where Tink had nearly finished extracting Oak's box without incinerating any bits of it. The horrible demonic voice abruptly returned. How interesting, how novel, what a truly unusual creature. You can't do that. The demon box's voice rose into an indignant squawk, rather undermining the whole amalgamation of Screaming Souls thing. Nubby, ever the idiot, immediately asked who couldn't do what now. Sodge's automatic order not to fraternize with the greater demon of Tzeentch was cut off by a sudden massive increase in the demonthrope's aura. Back in the hollow hall, all three of the warp portals flickered, twisted, flared with smoky green aurora, and abruptly vomited a little tidal wave of mutated chitin as demonic tyrannids started pouring out. Sergeant Gravis paused in his battle with massive twisted chaos spawn as its unstoppably mutating flesh mirrored the change in the summoning spell. Chitinous claws and gnashing mandibles erupted from several of the spawn's massive limbs, immediately lashing out to tear and devour everything around it, including itself. As one, the lesser Tzeentchian horrors turned to fight the unexpected new threat and began raising smaller portals of their own to bring in reinforcements. Not being equipped for shrugs, Sergeant Gravis made do with a bellow of have fun as he turned his battered chassis and determinedly started stomping away from the melee after his tactically withdrawing battle brothers. It's not even using them right, you know. It's just manifesting mindless warp apparitions and using my own winds to do it. Nubby helpfully informed the demon box that we calls them demonid. Sarge casually reached over and shoved him off the vehicle, causing the scribe to tap the plaque proclaiming no defenestrating occupants. The little trooper's outraged cursing followed behind us as he sprinted along on his augmetic legs and climbed back aboard next to Fumbles. The Seeker was doing better, at least for a given value of better that includes rocking back and forth, muttering to oneself and radiating a sense of impending doom. It was only a mild sense of impending doom though, at least compared to all the doom currently in progress. Tink, continuing his careful peeling of the demon box, angrily told Theo to shut up about homing the damn demonthrope and instructed him to tell the Margos that the box was still talking. There was a blast of angry binary, and the discussion quickly returned to the topic of just how Tink and Oak had messed up so badly as to get the Tesseract out of the box. A panting Nubby, climbing back on the cart, helpfully pointed out that it was actually a completely different Tesseract, cause the squiggly sigilly thing was different, and it don't got the gold inlay, neither. In a more curious tone, he added, wonder how they got it off. I couldn't peel off any of ours, not even with a plasma torch for the third or fourth time that trip. Everyone, including the driver, turned to stare. Then, the demon piped up again. Well, one of those two is an ancient artifact provided directly to the Ordos Malleus by its soulless creators, while the other is a random cube you found in a hole somewhere. Do you humans just assume every Necronta leaving is a Tesseract labyrinth? Annoyingly, the demon had a point. Even if we had found the random cube inside an actual Necron ship, which was only coincidentally inside a hole itself. But even if our cube wasn't a tesseract, or had just been critically damaged by an idiot with a plasma torch, we had a Melius certified substitute available. All we would have to do, the Margos claimed, was open up the damaged outer layer and reinsert it into the Wraithbone matrix, and then do a little troubleshooting while an enraged demon tried to devour our souls. Oh yes, I agree. Do you need my help peeling the metal off? Tink swore as the twisted mass of adamantine he'd been laboriously cutting through flaked off and started fluttering around like butterflies in our wake. Twitch and Amy, followed by the rest of us, started shooting them on the grounds that they were both demonic and bug-like. Tink looked at the fully exposed box and the massive cracks running through it, and hesitantly asked the Margos if he was sure this was a good idea, especially since the demon seemed to be on board with it. Smith responded with a generic scoff and pointed out that of course the demon agreed it was far smarter than any of us and started rattling off a list of tools, sensors, and rare anti-demonic wards. Tink's complaint that he didn't have any of these things was met with another scoff and instructions to stop being such a baby and improvise. Tact and the other two geezers immediately informed Tink that whatever he was doing, he was not doing it on this cart, per the clearly posted no use of heretical artifacts while the vehicle is in motion plaque. Both Tink and the box would have to get off, since we just arrived at the vehicle bay. This was accepted without complaint from anyone but the Margos and the demon. As we disembarked, the three elderly spies immediately resumed their unintelligible code babble, only pausing to ask us if they could keep Spot to use as a secure comb relay. Tink's immediate profanity-laden response was interrupted as the large blast doors that were the vehicle bay's main entrance cracked open just wide enough for someone to push Jim through. The tech acolyte looked like he'd had a day. Not a good day or a bad day, just a day. But since our standards were calibrated for a day on the occurrence border, that did include a rather wide range. In this case, what little remained of Jim's hair was standing straight up and little arcs of electricity kept on jumping up and down his augmetics. He was accompanied by a suspiciously oversized servo skull, which was projecting a familiar creepy smiling face. Fortunately, the creepy hollow Margos didn't seem interested in us since the skull zipped straight over to Tact and the whole lot of them abruptly drove off without so much as a try not to get yourself killed. Jim stared in vague confusion after the departing spies and hollow Margos, and then finally registered Tink and the demon box he was holding. The cogboy made a disgusted noise and pointed out that the tesseract was supposed to be on the inside, and asked if Tink had even read the installation instructions. Tink insisted he had, and that this was a second, different tesseract, on loan from the Ordo Melius, and unlike yours, this one is actually real. You should open up this box and try exchanging them as your first step. Tink instructed both of them to shut up and started forcing his way through the narrowly open door. Jim jumped backwards, began to say something, immediately thought better of it, and followed along. None of us knew exactly what an inquisitorial vehicle bay was supposed to look like, but IVG Mass 9 sure as hell didn't look like one. I mean, the room itself was as expected, but the Enginseers, lemon russes, and atmosphere of hectic cursing were guard issue. The fine banner blades we were less sure about, our regiment being considered too low priority to be issued anything fancier than 5th hand vehicular cast-offs. I mean, some of our chimeras had wheels. Amy was a different story. With an ear-piercing shriek of Harry, the markswoman lunged toward the nearest of the banner blades, jumping up to swing from its massive lascannon and then violently throwing herself at the nearest Enginseer. Sarge and Doc both reflexively moved to separate her from the unfortunate cogboy before she could do any damage, but instead, to our considerable shock, she was actually hugging the short, burly Enginseer who had popped up out of the front access hatch of her beloved banner blade. Well, not short, exactly. He was about as tall as Nubby, and that was without his legs, which he seemed to have swapped out in favor of a wide collection of macadendrites. Even more shocking was a cheerful halloo from the furthest banner blade, where the Rupert had perched himself for no readily apparent reason. As we jogged over, Jim and Tink already arguing with each other over the box and the tesseract, we spotted a gaggle of suspiciously well-dressed guardsmen brewing recaf over a small camp stove. Our former trainees gave us a friendly wave and cheer, but didn't actually get up. Alfred was more accommodating, though, and as we approached, he broke away from a pair of jittery sickers he'd been shepherding, and gave us the rundown. Actually, it was less of a rundown and more of a sprint past. The dapper sicker gestured back towards Amy, primly informed us that he had procured us transport, suggested that we get moving, and abruptly broke off with his attention fixated on Tink in the box. With an audible gulp, the psychic Batman backed up several paces and made a sort of warding gesture at us. He then abruptly turned around to sprint towards the Rupert, firmly suggesting it was time they got moving. Nonplussed, the Rupert gave us a cheery wave, announcing he'd bag a soul grinder for us. The collection of Enginseers fussing over his bannerblade clamored aboard with binaric whoops and a downright orcish level of enthusiasm. Twitch eyed them suspiciously, but Nubby informed him that that didn't count. It belatedly occurred to us that we had seen no actual tank crews in the bay, just lots and lots of cogboys. That number was rapidly dwindling as a bunch of heavy servitors manually cranked the bay's exterior doors open and the Rupert, followed by the 3 other banner blades, roared out onto the surface. Almost simultaneously, the remaining Enginseers marshaled up their servitors and filed out the door we'd entered through, immediately opening fire on whatever demonic horrors had been following us. In less time than it had taken us to cross the room back to Amy, the bay had more or less emptied, leaving just us, the burly Enginseer, and Harry. The cogboy gave our group a look over and asked who here knew how to run a night-grade fusion reactor. Tink immediately raised his hand, as Jim made more of an irk sound. Sarge yanked Tink's arm back down, directing the techie to focus on the damned box, while Amy pointed at Jim. Our faithful cogboy made a beating sound as several thick macadamrites wrapped around him and dragged him inside the massive tank. Amy told us not to worry, the machine spirits did most of the work. Nubby asked if he could drive. Everyone ignored him. As it turned out, Amy was the one who was driving, jacking a thick cable decorated with prayer seals into the socket in her skull and giggling with delight like someone getting attacked by an over-enthusiastic puppy. In a tone of familial pride, she proudly declared that Harry was the best Titan killer in the regiment she knew because her mom would let her sit on her lap and fire the volcano cannon. The tech priest, who was also named Harry, with an A, Amy clarified, explained that it was only once, and it had only been a warhound, and the machine spirit was the one doing the targeting anyway. Amy complained that he was no fun, and that he was embarrassing her in front of her inquisitorial co-workers. Ignoring the surprisingly friendly banter between our markswoman and the burly torso priest, a subtype of tech priest we were getting very familiar with, we trooped inside. Harry, or the Salvation of Heretics as the ornate gold lettering on the chassis declared it, was less a tank and more of a mobile bunker, a well-furnished one, with padded seats, recaf, and a little sign that said Fort Amelia. Keep out over a little cubby too small for anyone but Nubby to fit into. After a dire warning to the sawed-off trooper not to even think about it, the markswoman directed Tink to the large central chamber that shared the duties of com hub and mess hall. The techie, still arguing over the comms with both Theo and the Margos, dropped the demonic box on the table and started getting out his tools while Spot hung overhead transmitting a vid feed of his progress. The rest of us were directed to either man one of the point defense multi-lasers or get Amy a recaf. Down in the cramped Inginarium, Jim protested that he wasn't remotely qualified to work with any of this. Harry the Enginseer gave him conflicting assurances and death threats before scuttling away. As Amy ran through a bafflingly complex version of the litany of activation, Sarge belatedly realized that he'd run out of people to tell him what to do next. The squad had finally acquired transport of the most guardsmanly variety, but lacked any sort of destination. After a few fruitless seconds of pondering, Sarge asked Tink if there was anywhere we could go that would make fixing the demon box easier, and was instructed to frack off and let him work. Fortunately for our fearless leader, The tricky problem of where to go next was solved for him when a heavy cargo elevator directly ahead of us ground to life and a churning pile of mutated chitin rose into view. Amy scrambled through the rest of her litany, and the super heavy tank's machine spirit awakened with a chorus of beeps and slamming exterior hatches, nearly concussing Fumbles in the process. In front of us, the rising pile of demonids abruptly exploded outwards in a blast of psychic force, revealing a power-armored figure sporting an oversized headdress and an eyeball-covered staff. Amy scoffed, activated the auxiliary fire control, and without so much as a warning, fired the volcano cannon. The entire tank rattled and Jim let out a yelp of alarm as a ravening blast of coherent light reduced the Chaos Marine to a pair of smoking greaves. Cackling in triumph, our markswoman turned tank commander violently spun the massive vehicle around and floored it for the exit. Behind us there was an almighty crash as something almost as big as our banner blade smashed through the reinforced roof, followed by a swarm of screeching demonic flying fish. Which is to say, Doc briefly debated slowing down to offer some covering fire, but the squad of yellow armored space marines that stormed out of the drop pod seemed to have things under control. The planetary surface of wherever the hell we were had gone noticeably downhill since we'd last seen it. The demonic and demonidic portals were already having a noticeable effect on reality, tinging the sky with pink and green light and lightning, twisting the landscape into flesh, crystals, and chitin more or less at random, and spewing both warp energy and warp entities pretty much everywhere. Up in the turret, cowering as far away from the box as possible, Fumbles let out a whimpering sound and a wave of emotion radiated through us, mostly barely suppressed terror of several different varieties, but also a distinct premonition of doom, specifically in the form of something coming from 7 o'clock high. In the rear point defense turrets, Doc and Twitch flinched as their targeting screens jumped up to focus on a rapidly descending matte black shuttle, and the machine spirit displayed a target lock. Not bothering to question this, both troopers grabbed their respective controls and opened fire. The demon was not the only orc magnet in the area, though the explosions the shuttle's own multi-laser fire splashed off of Harry's armor without noticeable effect. The missiles might have been a different story if it weren't for the sudden premonition of fiery death and Amy's quick triggering of the smoke launchers. As the banner blade skidded into another hard turn, a barrage of crack missiles annihilated the highway directly ahead of us that led up to the shuttle pad. Swearing, Amy asked the Seeker if he had a premonition about where to go next, and nodded in surprised satisfaction as a clear and smokeless vision of the roadway leading down and away into the outer perimeter pushed into her mind. As we came into the clear, both Sludge and Twitch instinctively brought their multi-lasers up to bear on the suddenly visible shuttle, blowing out one of its engines and sending it down into a roiling mass of demonids pouring out of the vehicle bay behind us. That more or less set the tone for our expeditious retreat. Swarms of demonic fish flyers, inquisitorial aircraft of unknown loyalty, packs of demonids, both on the ground and skittering and supported through the air, bolts of warp lightning, and the occasional precision orbital strike seemed to home in on us from every direction. Between the tank's machine spirit and Fumbles' premonitions, our attention was brought to each new threat in the nick of time. All 4 multi-lasers were firing continuously, jumping from one target to the next, with the occasional assistance of the main cannon when something worth shooting was unfortunate enough to come across the volcano cannon's limited firing arc. It would have been quite fun if it wasn't for the damn demonic box arguing with Tink and then Theo and the Margos about whether we were going to open it or not. Tink had achieved a level of panic previously only observed in Gretchen and Nubby. He had no desire to open the demon box, and zero faith in the Margot's assurance that it was just one layer, and the creature would barely be more powerful at all. At least not by the standards of major demons. The demon's own assurance is that it wouldn't even be able to manifest a physical form, and that he was drastically overthinking things and wasting everyone's time was even less reassuring. Not having any better options, though, the techie waved spot in where it could transmit a clear vid to the orbital peanut gallery, jammed a highly scientific screwdriver under the box's lid, and twisted. In retrospect, unleashing a greater demon inside a contained space with a young telepathic seeker wasn't our best idea. Time abruptly ceased to have meaning, becoming something both wibbly and wobbly, not to mention disconcertingly visible, audible, and tasting slightly a burnt recaf. No smell though, which was a bit of a relief. The increasing clarity of Fumble's premonitions exploded into something else entirely, a mind-rending maelstrom of potential futures, all playing out simultaneously and stretching off into infinity. Trying to keep track of when now was impossible, except in all the timelines we didn't. Our deaths were swift and horrific, so it was better to stick to the ones where we did. If that logic sounds circular to you, just think about what it felt like for us. Tink wasn't even trying to listen to the insane cogboy screaming in his ear about the correct procedure for opening the damaged box without breaching the one inside. Navigating by the myriad visions of his prospective frack-ups and their immediate horrific consequences, the techie worked feverishly to stick to the future where the box didn't erupt in a tide of mutating pink fire or grow fangs and bite his face off. The rest of us were feeling it just as bad. Amy was laughing hysterically, steering the ungainly armored vehicle in seemingly random patterns across the rapidly mutating terrain of the plateau, hardly able to breathe for her laughing, and using one of her legs to fend off the levitating, twitching, pink static spewing form of Fumbles. The markswoman slewed the main gun around. Without even bothering to aim, she triggered the volcano cannon again, and a massive Lascannon beam punched straight through a swooping demonic flirant before continuing on for half a click to decapitate the large metal-legged demon trying to claw its way into the Rupert's banner blade. Sarge's attention was more focused, ignoring the present Charlie Foxtrot in a desperate leaderly attempt to figure out what the damn demon would do next. His aiming of the multi-LAS continuing automatically, he watched himself rapidly switch his comb bead through a dozen channels, barking orders with the singular authority of a non-common emotion. Squads of inquisitorial stormtroopers were redeployed toward the surface and directed towards the anti-air batteries to assist Hannah and the inquisitorial tech priests. Shuttles and drop pods were directed to new landing zones. Sergeant Gravis and his squad were directed to prepare for teleporter deployment, and Alfred was told to tell the Rupert to duck. Nobody even argued, which was definitely saying something in the case of the Lamenter's shipmaster, not to mention the squad of disaffected stormtroopers that he instructed to just frag that asshole. Doc's attention was more focused on the present, taping down the trigger on his multi-LAS and letting the Omniscient take the wheel. He scrambled back through the banner blade, pausing briefly to hold the box steady while Tink did a thing, and then reminding him that in 10 seconds it would be now. The medic dove into the Enginarium with a fire extinguisher in one hand and burn salve in the other. Jim, who was screaming in Binaric as he employed Tink's stick to the timeline where I don't blow us all up strategy, was greatly appreciative of both the extinguisher and the salve, as well as Doc's assistance in jettisoning the primary heatsink array. The less said about Nubby's attempts to establish a betting pool with his various selves about his own actions, the better. At least it kept him out of trouble. Twitch, though, was actively looking for trouble. One specific sort of trouble which he knew was coming because the Emperor had shown it to him, laid out clearly in the secret hidden patterns of his morning recaf. The paranoid demolitions trooper looked forward and found the orcs, and then started working his way backwards. There were the orcs, the more orcs, and the even more orcs, and then, if then was the right word, the horrors dredged from the darkest recesses of our imaginings, and then before that, as then became now. Tink triumphantly wrenched the cracked lid fully free from the box, and reality reverberated with a sigh of demonic satisfaction. Tink looked down in horror as his own premonitions abruptly coalesced into a single certain future, ending with two gloating demonic voices, one from the box and one from Fumbles, declaring, "Prescience is wasted on mortals." In a completely predictable repeat of our experiences aboard a certain Elder shuttle, the horrific sensation of a greater demon clawing its way into our soul radiated backwards along with the vision. All sense of self was subsumed. All sense of time, all sense of reality, nothing but demonic cackling and helpless terror at the prospect of being worn as some sort of flesh suit. It was incapacitating, and each crawling second just brought the horrible future closer. And then someone grabbed us by the collar and yanked us back to the present. Amy looked around in shock as Fumbles was hauled up and out of the tank by a hysterically screaming Twitch, taking the horrible visions with them as they jumped from the moving banner blade. The front of the moving banner blade, the markswoman threw the right tread into reverse in a desperate attempt to get out of Fumbles' aura, which had the happy side effect of not crushing him or Twitch under the treads. Her attention was perhaps a little too focused on this, since she entirely missed the brightly painted safety rail marking the edge of the plateau. Everyone inside the banner blade was already screaming, but it switched to higher register as the super heavy tank abruptly tilted at a severe angle and started a skidding spin down the massive scree slope below us. The only one not screaming, which is to say the demon, was complain gloating. Peeking ahead is unfair, you know. It spoils the surprise. But you did release me, and I am not on now when the ungrateful name your unwish and it shall be granted. As causality reasserted itself, Sarge shouted for a sit-up and clambered back toward the main chamber. Amy responded with a string of incoherent cursing. Doc reported a general lack of fires in the Enginarium. Jim vowed to kill Amy if she fired the damn volcano cannon again, and Tink was too busy hyperventilating and staring at the freshly revealed glowy box. Nubby, seizing the initiative, explained that he got Darfa's spooky box open, and now Dar1 inside is glowing and offering us all 3 wishes, including Twitch and Fumbles, and you guys on Darvox. That's 36 wishes. Sarge instructed Nubby to stop trying to scam the greater the demon, and pointed out that they were unwishes anyway, like the opposite of a wish. Nubby countered that that was actually an anti-wish. Tink, remembering that he was supposed to be doing things, broke in to point out that an anti-wish would be a weapon that specifically targets wishes. Nubby declared these both to be niche, but he'd take one of each along with his regular wish. We have a volunteer to go first then. Not so fast. First rule of being a guardsman, don't ever volunteer for nothing, so you always volunteer for something. I mean yeah, but not like, on purpose, or you know, willingly. Oh excellent. Then you're already familiar with the process. Harry rocked with a wave of distinctly pink tasting psychic energy, and everyone present froze. A considerable distance away, a psychic channel was briefly opened to the demonically possessed zoanthrope, alternately as the demonthrope, Frank, and the xenophantasmal warp jammer, and an unwish was granted. The Astartes known as Heart Marine, Grumpy, and Comet Apothecary had abandoned their positions, much to the consternation of their interim battle brother, who hadn't gotten Sarge's teleportation warning. The 3 Marines rushed towards the lumbering dreadnought they'd been covering and abruptly vanished along with it in a flash of pink light. Sarge's frantic final order to not kill the damn demonthrope ringing in their helmets. The 3.5 Space Marines dropped through the portal and into the astropathic sanctum of the Inquisitorial flagship Zenodium, right in front of a very surprised demonthrope. After a few seconds to see if they were going to all come back, the Deathwatch Marine shrugged. The blue and white horseshoe emblem on the Marine's shoulder shimmered to be replaced with a bird and blood drop pattern, and then he stepped into a patch of deep shadow and vanished. Inside the still crashing banner blade, Nubby pointed out that he didn't even think we could hit the demonthrope from here. And anyway, Jim said no more using the volcano cannon. Sarge ignored him and instructed Tink to get the frack to work. The techie screwed up his face, grabbed the glowing interior box. There was a flash of pink, a flash of green, and then the lights went out. Tell me, little technomancer, have you ever heard of the Void Dragon? It wasn't just the lights that went out, it was the entire damn banner blade. Amy screamed in outrage that if Tink had done something to Harry, her mom was going to kill him. Tink didn't have much attention to spare for the crashed and crashing tank, though, since Spot the Wonder Drone was currently trying to bash his face in. Amy, realizing that a response was not forthcoming, grabbed her pulse rifle and swore as it refused to fire on the friendly TAU drone. There is indeed a god in the machine, just not your omniscient. Sarge gave up on his attempts to contact Twitch as the comb bead went dead, and scrambled to help Tink fend off the possessed drone. His attention was caught by a brief flash of movement as something black and green scurried away from his tack light. At Sarge's shout, Nubby turned to track the skittering metallic thing and lashed out with a kick, which completely failed to connect as both of his leg augmetics locked up. As Sarge wrenched Spot off of Tink, fending off the drone's manipulator arm as it jabbed for one of his grenades, Tink registered the incredibly creepy metal legs scampering across his lap. With an incredibly girly scream, the techie lunged upwards, flinging the Necron scarab into the air and barely dodging a pulse of green light directed at his torso. Behind him, a perfectly square portion of the Bannerblade's hull abruptly vanished. You really shouldn't be toying with things you don't understand. The bright side of Harry's new window was the clear illumination of our mighty foe. Amy redirected her aim only for the rifle to refuse to fire again, debated throwing the damn thing, decided that was Sarge's shtick, and leapt down into the chamber while drawing her LS pistol. At which point, everyone went deaf and the Necron scarab exploded. Sarge swore as 2 of Nubby's 5 hastily aimed stub pistol rounds ricocheted into his chest plate, and Tink clutched at a bleeding leg. The heroic trooper in question said something which no one heard, and then ran to grab Doc before anyone could thank him for his quick thinking. This was probably justified, since Amy was still looking to shoot something and Spot seemed to be better now. Lacking anyone else to vent her frustrations on, the markswoman rounded on Tink, and attempted to shout something about not being such a baby. Tink, equally deaf and bleeding, did not fully grasp Amy's argument but managed to convey that he had A, been shot, and B, did not want another unwish, as the last one had gotten him shot. This was not the correct answer, and rather than continuing the pointless argument, Amy reached down and snatched the glowing interior box clear of its damaged casing. In retrospect, Amy's decision to handle a demonic artifact while mentally interfaced with a crashing Bannerblade was not one of her better ones. Before the markswoman turned tank commander even finished lifting the interior box clear, her entire body locked up as Harry the Bannerblade came back online and informed her of its displeasure, especially with the new hull and the continued crashing. That was unwise. Once again, there was a flash of pink and then a flash of green, not to mention another hole straight through Harry's hull. The only reason said hole didn't include Amy's face was a sharp jerk from Doc, yanking the markswoman off her feet as a small warp portal disgorged a bolt of familiar green and black lightning, ignoring the fact that she'd nearly just gotten her face burned off. Again, Amy clambered upright and declared her point proven. The stupid box was just summoning random warp portals, and Tink should shut up about his unwish and get back to work. Oh, unsatisfied, are we? Then the skin melted off everyone's faces. Amy shrieked in horror as her squadmate's skin sloughed away to reveal the blocky augmetics and blank expressions of servitors, all laughing with the toneless voice of a dead Margos. This screaming meltdown was briefly interrupted by the long-awaited conclusion of Harry's crash. The Bannerblade shook as our entire small avalanche slammed into the main access road, scattering the column of black armored chimeras crawling up it. What the Inquisitorial stormtroopers thought as our Bannerblade crashed through them, all weapons firing and turrets spasmodically twitching in time with its driver's hysterical screaming. Well, it was no surprise that so many of them opened fire. Not that anyone, save for Jim, even noticed the multi-lasers opening up on us. Doc and Sarge both moved to intercept the freaking out markswoman, to which she did not respond well. Sarge lurched backwards as a flailing foot caught him in the gut, and Amy scrambled past him and out of Doc's reach. Tink ignored all this silliness, his attention focused on the exposed platter of wraithbone circuitry at the bottom of the cracked outer box and the tech priest screaming at him over the reconnected Vox. This left Nubby as the only one in position to block the markswoman as she attempted to eject the demonic box via one of the Bannerblade's newly installed windows. Illusions provoke a dry and tasteless terror, but they can be much more prac. The demonic voice cut off as Nubby's grimy fingers snatched the box out of the air just ahead of a well-aimed last bolt coming the other way. Ignoring the near miss, The little trooper looked down triumphantly and announced that for his first wish he wanted Owen to make a revision of Dam Unitorum regulations vis-a-vis legitimate battlefield salvage, profits derived therefrom, and personal mercantile endeavors, Also, dat one about taking all the baths. Period. Nubby's outrage reply was cut off by a badly singed Jim, informing the rest of us that the sheer volume of incoming LAS fire was not helping with his badly overheating fusion reactor, and asking if one of us could do something about that. Tink casually swore at him, his attention wholly focused on the cracked circuit board which kept screaming elderly insults at him as he patched it. Sarge attempted to order a ceasefire. First by trying to poke his head out of one of the hatches only to duck back down as a blizzard of LAS fire targeted the new weak point, and then by trying to remember which comb channel the stormtroopers were supposed to be using. Doc informed him that this probably wasn't going to work without Fumbles helping, and applied bandages and fire suppressant as needed to Tink and Jim. Amy, having realized that her comrades had not been servitorized, and that Jim very much had a point about the fusion reactor, decided to take matters into her own hands and open up the throttle. The super heavy tank lurched forward, smashing two chimeras out of the way and then tilting alarmingly as it resumed its extended crash down the scree slope. Everyone, including the demon, swore at her for the lack of warning. On the bright side, not only did this get us out of the LAS fire, it also interrupted Nubby's argument with the demon over whether more semicolons would make his wish valid. Sarge debated leaving the box with the little trooper, on the grounds that the demon hadn't been doing anything, but then the box suggested that wishes were reserved for people who opened it. Without waiting to see how that would play out, the noncom snatched the demonic box away and clambered up through the forward hatch in anticipation of imminent demonic shenanigans. Instead, what he got was an odd demonic sense of pity. He's an idiot, you know. Yup, there was a flash of pink light, and something slammed into the slope ahead of us with the force of an artillery round. Through the dust, Sludge spotted something that looked like a human, a bird, and a ground meat patty hauling itself upright. What Amy saw was a figure of inexplicable, literally, handsomeness, oozing confidence and looking her straight in the eye through the intervening layers of armor plating. Without thinking, or even registering her own actions, the markswoman slammed Harry into reverse. If there was any doubt in our minds that the damn box had actually summoned Bane fracking Johns, it vanished as the 30-ton shadow sword banner blade tipped up on its spinning treads, began to flip, and stayed there. Rather than wait to see what the bastard was going to do next, Sludge raised his pulse carbine and fired his underbarrel flash launcher at the rapidly reforming interplanetary demon host of mystery. Unfortunately, but not unpredictably, Sludge fired his shot at the exact same moment as Amy realized she was about to be the first tank commander in both her regiment and family history to actually flip a banner blade over. Moving with the speed of blind panic, the markswoman spun the turret to protect the, comparatively, fragile volcano cannon from the impending crash. Sludge's flash grenade ricocheted off the spinning barrel with uncanny accuracy directly back into his face, followed a split second later by said barrel. Sludge blindly clung to the cannon with his armpits while the demonic box clutched in his hand laughed maniacally and the fully reformed Bane Johns leapt past him to perch on the rear of the improbably tilted tank. Sludge didn't even look at the demon box, keeping his eyes focused on the not very rapidly approaching forest at the base of the scree slope, and his mind as blank as possible. It didn't work. You're an idiot too, you know. Yup. No, not in the sense of your depressingly unexceptional intellect. Grunt. I mean your foolish belief that a bunch of half-remembered lessons and a stiff upper lip would be enough to hide your fears from a being that can taste your very soul. From below, there was a nasal "what did mine taste like?" Both Sarge and the demon ignored this interjection. And such an interesting fear, too. He is not my plaything, but I'm sure his owner won't mind me borrowing his toy. Any vestiges of Sarge's cool demeanor vanished as he looked down at the box in horror and struggled with the overpowering urge to throw it as far away from the tank as possible. So, Sergeant, let us see how unpleasant this Bane Johns fellow really is. Unlike Amy, the rest of the squad knew what Bane's arrival really meant. Tink hastily yanked his tools back from the cracked Wraithbone circuit board before he accidentally sucked himself into the Tesseract or something. In retrospect, he probably should have kept at least one of his hands on his work, though, because as he flinched backwards, intricate piece of heretical Xenotech slid across the increasingly tilted table to thwack with a painful cracking sound right next to one of the jagged hull holes. The Margos was not pleased, especially when his hasty effort to send Spot to retrieve the thing ended with the drone wedged in said hole. It could have been worse, though. He could have been Doc. Doc's own entirely rational decision to warn Twitch about Bane's arrival ran into a slight hitch as he mistuned his comb bead. He didn't mistune it to just any wrong frequency, mind you. No, he dialed into the recently reactivated headquarters stormtrooper TACnet. Despite being full of screams, orders, and confused reports of a runaway, possibly possessed banner blade intercepting their reinforcements, the entire network fell inconveniently silent as Doc connected and informed literally everyone that we were almost finished crashing and Oak's fracking demon box had just summoned Bane Bloody Johns. Nubby chimed in to tell him he was just 3 orcs away from winning the pool. Jim at least had the excuse of not personally encountering our stupidest nemesis, so he can probably be forgiven for accidentally doubling the techno-theologically dubious reactor's output, you know, instead of halving it, to prevent imminent fiery death. His panicked binary screeching as the power conduits around him overloaded was matched by Harry's own decidedly unhappy machine spirit. Thanks to Nubby's brilliant strategic decision to do absolutely nothing, he had an excellent view from Sarge's recently vacated hatch as Bane grabbed the now vertical volcano cannon and manually adjusted its aim a few degrees to point at the still open warp portal above. Ignoring Sarge's curses from his perch halfway down the barrel, the fully reformed Bannerhast peered down through the layers of armor plating directly into Amy's soul, and asked if the markswoman could lend a hand with his crazy ex. Not understanding any of what was happening, or why someone so incredibly, stunningly attractive was talking to someone as plain and common as her, the markswoman triggered Harry's volcano cannon, Sarge being rather preoccupied with keeping himself and the demon box from falling and being crushed under the banner blade's treads. He didn't notice as the pink light above abruptly shifted to red. The demon definitely noticed, though, breaking off its cackling comments about perhaps not returning such a fascinating toy with a sort of incredulous grunt as something yanked away its control of the warp portal. Taking this as his cue, Sludge did the only thing he could think of and let go of the barrel, smashing down into the turret below right as the volcano cannon fired. Nubby gawped gormlessly as something very big and very angry wrenched open the blood red gate, not even pausing as the beam of coherent light vaporized one of its massive arms. If anything, that helped it get through the portal faster. Bane let out a panic squeak as the hulking thing lunged down towards the improbably tilted tank and seized him around the torso with its remaining hand and let out a growling laugh like a lemon rust gunning its engine. Oh, ITZ Ivana High, Ivana Sarge, Nubby, the demon box, and a good portion of the stormtroopers watching from the road above stared in shock as something the size and strength, if not color, of an orc warbus raised Bane above its head and hurled him down the slope below with the force of a macro cannon shell, before jumping down after it. In a frenzy of violence punctuated by terrified demonic screaming and equally demonic laughter, the hulking figure smashed into Bane's rapidly reforming form, and went to work like an ogryn trying to break open a ration tin. The grisly scene continued for several seconds before Bane's screaming finally trailed off, and with a triumphant roar, and a cheerful wave at Nubby with her freshly reformed right arm, the demonic Hulk hurled Bane's twisted remains back up through the warp portal before jumping through after and yanking the portal closed. By Ivana, I genuinely did not see that coming. Any of it. Oh, that was Ivana. There's a cute couple. At which point, the banner blade finally finished crashing. We'd been in quite a few crashes in our careers, and while this one wasn't the fastest, it was definitely the biggest. All 316 tons of hairy the banner blade slammed into the large bane-shaped crater at the base of the slope. The laws of physics having finally reasserted themselves, the improbably vertical tank lurched forwards, sending our fearless leader flying though the scrubby, slightly mutated forest clinging to the foothills. Sarge briefly paused his cursing and flailing as the familiar if rather battered form of Spot the Wonder drone sailed by, smashing into one of the passing trees in much the same manner as Sarge did a few seconds later. Somewhere behind him, Nubby asked if he was dead, and also if he still had the demon box. Sarge swore at the little trooper, which we took as a no on both counts. There was a lot of cursing inside the overturned banner blade, too. Amy was switching between freaking out over having actually flipped a thrown damned banner blade and asking if we knew who that incredibly sexy guy with the wings was, while Jim frantically shut down the much abused fusion reactor. Tink searched through the detritus covering the overturned tank's roof, finally extracting the Wraithbone circuit board. Doc, having ascertained that no one present needed medical assistance or fire extinguishing, extricated himself through one of the side hatches and dragged Nubby down the slope after Sarge, not even stopping to help Sarge out of his tree. Nubby and Doc scrambled through the brush in a desperate search for the missing demon box. Sarge did his best to guide the two, aided, at least in theory, by the Margos and Theo who were still watching over Spot's vid feed. Nubby confidently assured everyone that he'd be the one to find it, him having a knack for this sort of thing, a sentiment which Doc not only agreed with but fully supported, being more than happy to leave this unwished stuff to the rest of the squad, which was probably why the demon gave him a little help, following the directions being shouted at him, and not questioning just who was giving them. The medic shook a particularly battered looking tree and shouted in panic as something dropped directly onto his helmet. Reflexively, and directly against his decision to let Nubby handle the damn thing, the medic caught the falling box in both hands. As warp energy surged around him, the medic took solace in the fact that as bad as this would be, at least it hadn't been Twitch who'd grabbed the summon your worst fear box. Oh, why not a good kilometer uphill of all this? Twitch continued his hasty descent of the scree slope, and debated what to do about all the chimeras and stormtroopers in his way. By the time he'd tranquid fumbles, crammed the Sicker into a partially collapsed maintenance shed, and mined the surrounding area, the demolitions trooper had fallen pretty far behind. Fortunately, there was a nice clear trail to follow, and a bunch of stormtroopers pointing the way with their flashlights. He briefly paused his scrambling descent as yet another warp portal opened, but broke into a full sprint when he, along with everyone else, found out just what had come through it. His debate over how best to get past the stormtroopers came to an abrupt end as a pink warp portal opened right in front of him, and he abruptly crashed into Doc's back. Both Twitch and Doc's panicked shouts were overwhelmed as the demolitions trooper's hands closed on the falling box and the demon started laughing. Pink lightning rose out of the box like a warpy Tesla coil, throbbing in time with the cackling demon and branching upwards into something massive. How novel, how delicious, how illogical and logical and unlogical truly. You are an artisan of paranoia, but as we all know, it's not paranoia if they really are out to get you. Overhead, the grasping tendrils of lightning coalesced into a warp portal that stretched from one horizon to the other. It was full of orcs. Well, it wasn't completely full of orcs. There was enough space between them for a fair bit of air, ordnance, and the crashing remains of several fighter bombers. That said, it was the biggest airdrop we'd ever seen, and we were in the bloody guard. What was even more amazing, though, was the actual fracking parachute, something previously thought beyond orcish understanding, which probably explained all the ones made of metal. Further speculation was interrupted as a large ballistic squig smashed into the overturned banner blade with the force of a light artillery shell. As everyone else's cover-grabbing instincts activated, Twitch stood there for a second, gaping upwards as the horrible future fumbles had shown him finally arrived, and dropped the box. Oak's carefully crafted demonic prison smashed to the ground and more of the seals cracked open. The demonic laughter rose in pitch as a tide of warp energy, pink fire, and a bird-like head erupted from the box. Twitch's little knee-jerk decision to punt the damn thing probably wasn't the most logical or sensible, but at least it caught Owen by surprise as it arced through the air, bouncing off tree branches and orc paratroopers. Twitch's running in circles while screaming and throwing explosives in every direction was presumably more in line with its expectations. The situation was well and truly fracked. While Twitch's punt didn't break open the box any wider, thank the Emperor, by the time Sergeant Nubby managed to catch up with the thing, it had already started opening warp portals, and a second head had emerged. Lacking any better ideas, the two guardsmen opened fire on the avian heads, which barely seemed to inconvenience the demon. The pair quickly gave up entirely as two capering, pink warp things emerged from the portals. The orcs were a bit more persistent, though, and the flares of warp energy and pink light drew them in like moths to Illuminator. The demon was not the only orc magnet in the area, though. The explosions radiating outward from Twitch's constantly shifting position were probably visible from low orbit. And then there was the banner blade. The only reason that every single orc in the region wasn't heading straight for us was the very helpful distraction being provided by the column of Inquisitorial stormtroopers just up the hill. Despite how appealing a proper fight was to the average greenskin, there was no way that they were ever going to ignore something as lootable as an overturned banner blade. As Amy finally unplugged herself from the damn tank and climbed her way outside to check on both the general situation and where the hot guy went, she flinched in shock as a large figure landed right above her. The markswoman looked up at a massive, coat-sporting greenskin wearing the battered remains of an undersized red hat on its head, and, I shit you not, doing the cane pose on the overturned tank. Amy paused for a slack-jawed second, forgetting entirely about inexplicably sexy mystery men, and then raised her rifle and blew the posturing commissar's head off. Inside the overturned banner blade, Jim triumphantly crawled out of the enginarium just in time to watch Tink suck his entire work surface, along with most of his tools, into a separate dimension. Rather than comment on Tink's inability to read the clearly marked "this side up" on the Tesseract control unit, the Tech Priest smugly declared that he'd known it had been a real Tesseract, and the stupid box demon was full of shit. Tink nodded along with all of the confidence of someone who had completely forgotten about the Tesseract not being real stuff, and asked if Jim could pretty please help him find the range and targeting controls on this thing. Their work was almost immediately interrupted by Amy slamming her hat shut and screaming at Jim to get the fusion reactor back on before the greenskins got in. Jim let out a generic whine of despair as he crawled back into the sweltering half-slagged remains of the Bannerblade's enginarium. From Doc's perspective, Amy's panic was a bit premature. Sure, there were nearly a dozen assorted greenskins and squigoids crawling over the crash tank, but that was nothing compared to the sheer number he was trying to keep off of Twitch with his pulse carbine. The demolition trooper's one-man artillery barrage drew in the descending greenskins like a beacon, which was presumably why he'd started with the mines. Even with a good 3/4 of the incoming greenskins running afoul of Twitch's explosives, Doc still was hard-pressed to keep any of them from closing on the panicking demolitions trooper, and there was nothing he could have done about the squig. Fortunately, Twitch only lost half his toes kicking the vicious critter away. Doc debated whether it would be possible to get close enough to bandage the badly bleeding limb in question, but his self-preservation instincts won out. Despite the fact that they were facing an increasingly unbound greater demon, Sergeant Nubby's front of the battle was surprisingly low-key. After dropping the first pair of pink horrors, both guardsmen concluded that the orcs were doing a very good job at keeping the demon and its minions busy, and didn't need their help. Before Nubby could run off to do something stupid, Sludge dragged the little trooper behind a convenient chest-high overturned tree and began to commit strategery. A quick vox to Tink confirmed that the Tesseract control panel was working and now had a range of up to 3 meters, which gave Sarge a nice clear objective. The problem was that the scrum of greenskins, lesser demonic horrors, and general mayhem surrounding the target had a radius of significantly larger than 3 meters. Unfortunately, The obvious solution involving his and Nubby's entire supply of grenades was ruled out by the necessity of not breaking the damn box any further, which meant Sarge had to go with plan C, which was for Cretin reloading the launcher on his carbine and readying his supply of smokes and flashes. Sarge grinned down at his trusty comrade and delegated the problem. Nubby, who was currently deeply regretting his insistence that the demon box has no powers over me cause he ain't gave me my wish yet, sidled forward as Sarge launched his barrage. The non-com's entire supply of smoke and flash grenades sailed into the melee around the demon box, exponentially increasing the level of confusion and enraging the eyeball-covered chaos spawn that had just emerged from yet another summoning portal. Nubby sprinted through dozens of orcs in various states of belligerent confusion, ducked under the flailing arm of the blinded chaos spawn, dodged just around the edge of the warp portal, and finally yoinked the demon box. Sarge grinned in triumph as the two bird-like demonic heads looming over the smoke were abruptly yanked sideways with an outraged squawk. Nubby was less enthusiastic about the plan, at least judging by the terrified screaming as he flailed the barely contained eldritch horror around like a floppy power sword. The demon's serpentine appendages carved a path of destruction and mutation through both the greenskins and its own minions, and the entire smoke cloud lit up with pink fire and lightning in the wake of Nubby's panicked retreat. Sergeant Doc laid down covering fire as Nubby burst out of the smoke with the demon box and sprinted up towards the overturned banner blade. This proved to be a bit optimistic, though, since the little trooper only made it a few paces out of the smoke before the demon got tired of Nubby's shit. Unhand me. Nubby stared in shock as his hands abruptly let go of the box. Lurching to the side in a desperate attempt not to tread on the damn thing, the little trooper stumbled and smashed face first into the ground as his traitorous arms refused to catch him, instead wrapping around his neck with long green fingers. Doc and Sarge, lacking any better ideas, opened fire on the demon's appendages, focusing on the base of an arm that it was using to open yet another warp portal. While the pulse fire didn't do any lasting damage, the barrage definitely screwed up its spell. The warp portal collapsed with a flash of pink light and a sudden rain of confused orcs. Sergeant Doc paused their firing as something like a dozen angry greenskins set to work trying to hack off the demons' heads, aided by even more coming in from above and every other direction. Sarge pointed out that we were now in pretty much the exact situation we'd been in before, except now Nubby was trying to strangle himself. Doc's response was interrupted by a massive, familiar boom as Twitch finally ran out of grenades and switched to depth packs. The Battle of Harry, circa M40 something, was a messy and chaotic affair, which made sense given it was taking place entirely within the confines of an overturned banner blade. Amy's panicked retreat back through the side hatches had signaled an end to Jim and Tink's little Xenotech party. As Jim ran off to get the beleaguered reactor started again, Tink finished mounting the Tesseract controller on spot the Wonder drone and was given an excellent opportunity for field testing as a slavering ball of teeth attempted to bite his face off. The squig which one of the orcs had crammed through the hull holes disappeared in a flash of green light, fortunately not taking anything else, like, say, the entire banner blade, with it. His field test successful, Tink took a cue from the greenskins and sent his own pet back out through the same hole. As Spot zipped away, the overturned tank came to life with a series of angry machine spirit noises and slamming external hatches. As a monotone voice reported 3.6 intruders detected, Tink readied his plasma gun and for literally the first time since spending several thousand thrones on getting the feature installed, set the nozzle to mist. The .6 of the 3.6 orcs was in the Enginarium, flailing madly with its free arm and leg as it struggled to get free of the hatch Jim had slammed on it. Ignoring the greenskin as something far less likely to kill him in the next 10 seconds than the reactor, Jim hastily got to work while fending off the occasional thrown item and gobbet of spit. The Xenos' presence was a bit distracting, though, so as Jim worked, he tasked his two LAS-equipped Macadandrites to finish it off. Annoyingly, this only made the Xeno more noisy, the LAS pistol caliber beams failing to penetrate its thick skull. With a resigned sigh, Jim recalled the two Macadandrites, dug out Doc's fire extinguisher, and just triggered the reactor's emergency plasma vent again. Amy was too busy trying not to get killed to pay much attention to why the Enginarium was on fire. Again, the greenskin that had been climbing up through the turret hatch had taken 3 shots to put down, and it was only by the Emperor's grace that none of its unaimed bolter rounds hit anything vital. Once she'd finally landed a headshot, the markswoman hastily scrambled back to reconnect the new cable and activated the tank's infantry defense protocol. As Harry's machine spirit activated its multi-lasers, Amy turned her attention up towards the rest of the tank, only to flinch backwards as some colossal idiot fired an anti-armor plasma weapon inside of a sealed tank. The good news was that while several cogitator banks were slagged and the upholstery was on fire, and the entire place smelled like cooked orc, Tink had actually managed to take out both of the remaining commanders. The bad news was that despite removing a good third of its brain, Amy had not actually managed to finish hers off. The greenskin she'd been standing on abruptly sat up, one hand holding its remaining brain matter and while the other raised its weapon and triggered its underbarrel flamer. Shrieking in panic, the markswoman flung herself out of the turret not quite ahead of the blast of flaming promethium and rolled around, cursing, as she tried to beat out the flames clinging to the blackened stump of her left leg. Barely clinging to consciousness, Amy wisely decided that finishing off the not quite dead greenskin took a back seat to survival, and ordered Harry to cycle the turret hatch. The mangled commando bellowed in outrage as it was dumped onto the ground, and with that the perimeter was secured before Tink could fire his damn plasma gun inside again. Amy wasn't the only one sporting a fresh stump. Doc had given up supporting Twitch now that he'd started with the det packs, and sprinted over to give Nubby a hand with his hands. Unfortunately, the Military Medici manual didn't have an entry for limb S, mutated and given dark sentient-inspired Sentian curse, which meant it was time to get back to the basics with good old Dr. Lascater. Nubby screamed shrilly as his left arm was severed above the elbow, a marked improvement over the patient's previous choking and writhing in Doc's opinion, and a clear sign that the treatment was working. Before the medic could capture Nubby's other limb for treatment though, the little trooper scrambled away, insisting he had his other Gretchen-knifed arm had reached an understanding. Doc decided not to argue. All this mayhem meant that Sarge, per usual, was the only one paying attention to the damn mission in general and the damn greater demon of Tzeentch in particular. This was rather frustrating, since Sarge could recognize a tactical fracking moment when he stepped in one. Despite the loss of one or more of Nubby's limbs, his mission to extract the box from the Orc vs Demon scrum had been a success, and Sarge could see flashes of green necrotic light overhead as Spot tesseracted a swathe through the descending commanders. So when Sarge screamed at Tink to get his drone down here and tesseract the demon, he was rather unhappy to hear that the techie was a little busy trying not to be on fire. Jim was no help either, even though he was more or less fireproof at this point, resembling nothing so much as a pile of foam with augmetics poking out. Thankfully, there was a third tech expert on the call. Attention, those idiots. The Mago wishes me to. Sarge informed Theo of where he could cram the Mago, and instructed the TAU to get control of Spot and send it toward the big fracking demon. Now the Xenos attempted to explain the concept of time lag and the complications of a massive warp portal being between his control station and the drone, but Sarge was not in the mood for petty excuses about the laws of physics. Shortly, but with a lot of whining and sotto voce TAU cursing, a compromise was reached and Spot 3.0's little machine spirit had its target priorities reassigned. As the drone zipped back downwards, Theo seized the lull in the conversation to inform Sarge that the Mago is about to deploy the Xenopsionic reality abuser. There was a pause as Sarge attempted to parse this, and then Theo attempted to explain. You know, the one with the squigs. Sarge paused again and asked just what he meant by deploy. Aboard the occurrence border, Theo looked between the Widboy's glowing, crackling stasis chamber and the ranting Margos. Observe. TAU minion, today we shall answer the question that has plagued mankind since I thought of it 7.325 years ago. When an orc seeker is overwhelmed with unfathomable levels of xenopsionic energy, what do we call it? Is it a gorkast or a morkast? Theo pondered this and then informed Sarge that it was deploy as in strategic class ordnance. He should probably duck or something and not look directly at any warp portals. Sarge swore as the Theo started counting down. Twitch, who was apparently still on the comms, screamed at everyone to hit the dirt and prepare for the great insquigioning. Ignoring all of this, Sludge focused his attention on the swiftly descending form of Spot the Wonder drone and realized he might have been mistaken about that whole tactical moment thing, because Sarge was not the only one following Spot's descent. While two of the demon's limbs were opening new warp portals and another was throwing spells at the odd pursuing greenskin, one of its heads had its gaze focused on the approaching drone. Realizing that he had well and truly fracked up, Sludge did the only thing he could think of and screamed at the rest of us to do something. Inside the Bannerblade's smoldering interior, Tink abandoned his unimportant job of keeping himself and Amy alive in favor of a far more important matter. Yanking out his drone controller, the techie mashed the first few buttons he could find in a desperate attempt to save his waifu. Fate was on our side, as it turned out, because one of the buttons Tink hit was Spot's newly installed chaff function. In a flash of necrotic light, the drone reversed its tesseract, and the area between it and the demon was abruptly filled with dozens of confused and belligerent orcs. Several bolts of homing demonic fire smashed into the falling greenskins as the drone veered away into a holding pattern, and Sarge breathed a sigh of relief, which was when the Widboy detonated. The warp portal above us exploded. Theo had not been kidding about the strategic class ordnance part, and there was a blast of raw psychic energy that dwarfed even the greater bloody demon in front of us. Both of the creatures bird-like had screeched in outrage as its own newly formed portals unraveled in a blast of green lightning, and that was nothing compared to what the shockwave did to the greenskins. The orcs bellowed as power boiled through them, swelling their muscles to grotesque proportions and infusing their weapons with sparking green energy, except for the ones that just exploded or turned into abnormally large squigs. Howling their traditional war cry, the empowered greenskins hurled themselves towards the demon, and from the sound of things, they were actually causing some real damage. Sarge confidently announced that this was actually the tactical moment. Probably. Tink and Amy barely even noticed all of this since Jim had finally run out of fire suppressant, which meant it was time to abandon land ship. Amy ordered Harry to open the turret hatch, and both she and Tink dropped unceremoniously onto the nice, cool ground. The sense of relief was slightly spoiled by the large, cranially impaired greenskin standing over them, boiling with green lightning, which then exploded. Amy cursed as she was once again doused with orc bits, while Tink screamed that now his legs had been blown off, or at the very least fractured. So it was easy to see why neither of them were in the mood for Sarge's tactical moment BS. The noncom was insistent, though we had until the demon and the glowing greenskins either killed each other or got bored to set things up for our final attack. Sarge, Doc, and Nubby would get in position to lay down covering fire while Amy sniped the demon. Tink used his plasma gun to carve a path for Spot, and Twitch would ruin everything by throwing a jetpack right into the middle of our distraction. Despite Sarge's well-honed reflexes, he didn't quite make it to the ground before the jetpack went off. He was thrown over backwards by a blast of heat and orc bits, and a large ballistic orc limb clocked him squarely in the helmet. Fighting to maintain consciousness, the noncom hauled himself upright to groggily make eye contact with a large squig wearing combat boots and a bandolier. Per the laws of narrative causality, Twitch regained his composure just after literally blowing Sarge's plan out of the proverbial water. A quick look around was enough to confirm that the glowing orcs were both real and surprisingly durable, with several of the ones he'd just jetpacked already getting back up. Nearby, Doc was down and swearing at Nubby, who ducked behind him just in time to dodge most of the shrapnel, and was now staring in confusion at the green, glowing arm that seemed to have regrown when he wasn't looking. Twitch hastily popped a stim and announced that he had fracked up and was sorry. Nubby shrugged, both green arms cooperating now, hit both himself and Doc with stims, and reassured Twitch that we'd all fracked up. Amy and Tink both cut in to object to Nubby's comment, only to immediately accuse each other of crashing and setting fire to Harry the Bannerblade respectively. Ignoring the argument, Jim, who had actually done nothing wrong, descended from the smoking wreckage of the Bannerblade and asked Sudge whether it was still the tactical moment or not. Sudge swore, assured everyone it was, and just as soon as he'd finished sorting things out mano a squigo, he was going to prove it. Tink was understandably dubious about Sudge's assertion, but a quick check of Spot's vid feed proved the noncom almost right. The demon's box had somehow emerged from the explosion unscathed, and the writhing pink limbs were preoccupied fending off the most obstinate of the wire-confused greenskins. Spot really could get close enough to tesseract the demon, provided he had a bit of covering fire from the squad's heavy weapons. That would be tricky though, since Harry wasn't going anywhere, and neither will he or Amy unless their own limbs conveniently regenerated. Jim coughed and asked whether Tink or Amy wanted him to carry them up to the lip of the crater. Tink rejected this offer, declaring that he'd have his hands full with Spot, and thrusted his plasma gun at the tech priest with instructions to do his best. Jim declined, backing away, only to run into something much worse, as Amy grabbed his leg and asked whether Harry's capacitors had one last shot in them. Jim looked at the heavy cable still connecting the markswoman to the half-slagged banner blade, and checked to see that the volcano cannon really was both intact and pointing roughly the right direction. With a sigh, the tech priest announced that yes, Harry's capacitors did indeed have one last shot in them, at least if she didn't mind them, followed by Harry's reactor, followed by everything in the immediate vicinity being reduced to subatomic particles. The markswoman merely nodded and stated it was for the best, this way her mother would never have to know the shameful truth. Amy and Tink began shouting orders, which were generally ignored since Doc was busy patching up all the holes the air-busting greenskin had left in him. Sludge was still duking it out with the squig, and Nubby wasn't paying attention. This just left Twitch to use his fracking marker light for once in his fracking life. Confirming that Tink and Amy were ready, Twitch leaned out of cover and sighted on the glowing, levitating box. Unfortunately, the demon was ready for something like this, and Twitch didn't even get his weapon fully raised before one of the demon's bird-like heads turned to pin him with its gaze. Twitch screamed as demonic laughter filled his mind, growing increasingly malicious and guttural as the last fragments of his sanity finally shattered. Nubby peeked his head over his own cover, and helpfully informed everyone that Twitch had screwed up again, and on that note, he was feeling a lot less confident about going next and suggested that maybe it should be someone not habitually, possibly genetically, inclined to colossal frack-ups. Nubby wasn't really asking, as Doc suddenly learned when the little trooper grabbed him by the chest plate, pushed the medic's pulse gun into his hands, and then hauled the poor bleeding Doc up to the edge of cover with instructions to do the thing while I does the other thing. Doc stared at Nubby, attempting to bring the little trooper into focus, and began to ask what any of this was about, only for the little trooper to spring up straight toward the box with his Gretchen Y arms outstretched, declaring that Owen still owed him his wish and or anti-wish. Owen was unamused, shrieking with demonic rage. Both heads as well as two clawed limbs all whipped towards the annoying little trooper. Nubby screamed and immediately reversed direction, and then reversed several more times while scrambling to dodge a barrage of demonic pink and blue fire interspersed with the occasional lightning bolt. Doc, belatedly realizing that he was expected to do something other than, bleeding out, activated his marker light. Amy and Tink were far less ready than Twitch, or Nubby for that matter, had assumed. As the marker light signal registered, the pair were still arguing over whether they needed a second separate marker light for the covering fire. Sudge, arm deep in a squig and not happy about it, cut in to direct the markswoman to just fracking eyeball it. With a frustrated growl, Amy raised the overturned Bannerblade's volcano cannon to match the line of her pulse rifle and ordered Harry to fire. As it turned out, Amy's careful aiming was a bit unnecessary, since the blast that came out of the volcano cannon was something more akin to a badly tuned melter gun than a pinpointless cannon strike. Amy shrieked in surprise and pain as the crater was flooded with backblasts of searing heat and semi-molten rock. That was getting off easy, though. Everything downhill of the banner blade, on the other hand, unknown the unseeing lived up to his name, not looking away from Nubby until the ravening blast of energy roiled over it, annihilating its 4 exposed appendages and blasting apart the box that Amy had been trying so hard to miss. Not to mention several hundred cubic meters of rock and greenskin. Fortunately it didn't matter, because Owen only got 37 milliseconds to enjoy his sudden freedom. This was the time it took for Doc's marker light to re-establish lock on the emerging demonic figure. Spot the one that drones it forward, barely above the poorly focused energy blast. Then, as its sensors reacquired the target, it dove in and activated the Tesseract. As silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by sizzles and cracks as the large molten gash in the hillside cooled and hardened, and then by a clattering crash as Spot 3.0 failed to pull out of its dive. The psychic shockwave of the demon's sudden absence could be felt all the way in orbit, which was incredibly convenient for Sergeant Gravis, who had actually been growing tired of bashing the demonthrope's skull into established dominance. The apothecary had tried to tranquilize it despite Gravis's advice not to bother, but nothing short of repeatedly flattening its metal-plated head seemed to do the trick. But now, at long last, 2 massive itch-stained power fists clenched tight and tore the writhing mass of chitinous flesh and living shadow in 2, and then 3, and 4, and so on, until the throne-damned screeching finally stopped and the cursed thing fled back into the warp. Behind him, his 3 battle brothers cheered as the demonics around them faded into smoke and the warp portal slid closed. The former astropathic sanctum of the former ship. Gravis was not entirely clear which ship, but probably not the occurrence border. Thank the Emperor, didn't appear to have a readily accessible landing pad. But Sergeant Gravis was damned if he was going to let some cog marine try to teleport him out of this place. The Lamenter's Thunderhawk that picked up their retrieval beacon was surprised to find a dreadnought with 3 space marines mag-clamped to it floating in space, but judging by the condition of the demon-infested wreck beyond them, this was probably an easier pickup. There was no Thunderhawk extraction coming for us Guardsmen, though, and no Valkyries, either, since even if the giant orc-spewing warp portal had finally fizzled out, there was still the matter of all the shrieking demonic fish things, anti-air fire, and the sudden resumption of orbital strikes. With the brief silence broken, Amy started alternating between incoherent groaning and swearing as she registered her new burns and even shorter leg stump. Mustering what was left of her will, the markswoman declared that at least it hadn't been the face, for once, and passed out. A surviving commando clambered up with a pained woo-woo and Twitch started screaming hysterically while hosing the offending greenskin with pulse fire. Ignoring the brief firefight, Tink reported the blatantly obvious fact that Spot had been successful, and then asked if Jim could come carry him once he finished determining if the banner blade was exploding or not. Jim swore at him without looking up, and instructed the techie to crawl over and help Amy before she bled out and no piggyback rides. Doc was in similarly bad shape, the burns inflicted by the poorly focused volcano cannon tapping out his last reserves and leaving him unconscious. Nubby didn't think he was going to bleed out right now, though, and there was still the matter of that remaining wish and anti-wish he'd been promised. Sarge returned from his showdown with the squig, missing both his combat knife and right arm up to the shoulder. In retrospect, trying to stab a squig in the face hadn't been his best tactical decision, but he still had his pulse rifle and was ready to marker light something, just in case. He was disappointed but relieved to find Nubby crouched over a pile of drone scrap where the demon box had been while Twitch brandished his pulse rifle in the small trooper's face. Sarge watched as Nubby kept digging, ignoring the gun in his face and casually assuring Twitch that it had just been his arms and they'd reached agreement anyways. as Nubby pried loose the surprisingly intact Tesseract controller tablet and verified that the Necron QB thing was still properly in place and all the lights was on, Twitch abruptly yanked the device away, screaming that the little trooper couldn't be trusted. Sarge took this as a good sign as to the demo trooper's mental state, appointed him Tesseract holder, and went to go find Doc and his medkit before anybody bled out. Sarge's bandaging was interrupted by a report from Jim that yes, indeed, Harry the Bannerblade would be exploding and we had 3 minutes to get out of there. Given Doc's unconsciousness, Amy's legless unconsciousness, and Tink's insistence on piggyback rides, Sarge was not optimistic about our chances, but you had to try. Before Sarge could decide on a direction though, Twitch ran over to Tink and shoved the Tesseract controller toward the techie with one hand while brandishing his pulse rifle with the other. Something in Twitch's incoherent babble and violent gesturing got the message through, and Tink hastily took out the other supposedly not a Tesseract and exchanged it for the one full of greater demon. Tink did understand why removing the demon-filled Tesseract was important, but didn't grasp why Twitch wanted the other one until the demo trooper yanked the controller back and scrambled up the lip of the crater with it. Jim yelped in alarm as the ominously humming wreck he'd just climbed out of vanished in a flash of necrotic light. The tech priest announced that he had been sure that it had been a Tesseract since they had, actually tested it, and it was a good thing nobody had thrown it away. Twitch wasn't listening, preferring to cackle madly and limp around the crater tesseracting up the still twitching greenskin bodies that had been underneath. Since the whole exploding Bannerblade problem had solved itself without him needing to do anything, Sarge decided that we might as well rebase to the vacated Bannerblade crater and fought up, with the Doc draped over his remaining shoulder and the medkit strap clenched in his teeth. Sarge trudged past where Tink was patching up Amy and unsympathetically dumped his cargo into Jim's exhausted lap while he turned to survey the tactical situation. Without Spot, the team's comb beads couldn't reach orbit, so Sarge started flipping through the usual guard channels. He immediately regretted this decision as a booming voice started screaming in his ear, and futilely tried to switch the channel until he realized whatever it was being broadcast on all frequencies. It was an automated message, on repeat, informing all Imperial forces that the Ordo Malleus had subdued the demon and was initiating containment and cleanup protocols. All ground units were to take up containment positions, and hold all Inquisitorial agents for debrief. Sarge didn't need the little psychic voice in his head to tell him that he didn't want to know what an Ordo Malleus debriefing consisted of. Sarge thanked the voice for its concern, and asked if that really was Tact's voice he was hearing and not just a blood loss induced hallucination. Tact instructed him to shut up and get the frack out of the area before we got captured and fracked up a century and a half of his work. As an afterthought, he told us to try not to die, unless we'd gotten the Lady General's daughter killed, in which case death probably was the best option. Sarge asked if Tact could tell him something he didn't already know, and the annoyed Inquisitorial bureaucrat waspishly asked if he knew about the Cathedral of Containment being orbitally dropped on our position. Sarge looked up at the steadily growing identified falling object burning down overhead, and agreed that he had been wondering about that. Tact, still not having said anything useful, signed off the psychic call with a complaint that he had to go and deal with the Lord Inquisitor now. And Sarge decided that don't get caught and try not to die were good enough orders to roll with, which meant it was time to follow the NCO disaster response checklist. The perimeter was secure, at least judging by all the green flashes as Twitch continued his rampage. The chain of command was useless, and the backup would probably kill us and convert our carcasses into servitors, which just left finding some friendlies ourselves. Fortunately, when you're in the guard, you've got a lot of friends. Sarge declared his intention to go and make contact with that column of stormtroopers that we'd crashed through on our way down the hill. Admittedly, there might be some hard feelings about the crash, and they were firing more or less in the squad's direction, but Sarge was sure that as long as we kept Nubby at the back of the group, they wouldn't mistake us for greenskins. Jim rasped a sigh through his secondary vocoder. having lost both his primary and biological versions to the fire, and asked Sarge if he was certain he'd understood the bit in the Vox broadcast about all Inquisitorial agents being held for debrief. Sarge assured the Shard Tech priest that he sure as shit didn't see any Inquisitorial agents around here, but he'd be certain to report to his fellow guardsmen if he saw any. Jim ceded the point with a shrug and gestured his sole remaining Macadam right in the general direction of the green flashes and Twitch's maniacal laughter. He asked if Sarge intended to explain the demo trooper's new favorite toy as an oddly flat, green, and wraithbone Alaskan. Sarge was still pondering the problem of the hysterical demo trooper and his blatant architect when Nubby sidled up and reported the issue taken care of. Boz Sarge idly cussed Nubby out for using a non-standard address to a superior officer before catching up with what he'd just heard and realizing the green flashes were getting more and more distant. Before he could ask, Nubby volunteered that Twitch had volunteered, you know, for rear guard, like, covering our escape and all that. Sarge groaned, asked whether Twitch had actually volunteered for anything, and was not amused with Nubby's probably. The cretinous little trooper rushed to explain that it wasn't like he suggested, well, anything. The crazy bastard had been babbling about trying to catch that big rock before it lands and unleashes an unstoppable tide of my kind on this world. Sarge grudgingly admitted that Nubby was probably right. At Sarge's order, a carrying harness was fashioned for Amy out of her own weapon strap and half a roll of duct tape, hefting Doc with his remaining arm and staggering under the weight of the two unconscious guardsmen. He began leading the way uphill. Behind him, Tink and Jim supported each other in a sort of drunken tripod while Nubby fiddled with the Necron cube thingy last seen in Tink's possession, muttering under his breath about his damn wish. Sarge ordered him to stop playing with the Eldritch dimensional prison thingy before he unleashed a pissed off greater demon on our asses, and stash it somewhere it wouldn't be found until we got to Oak. As the exhausted party trudged up the hill, the massive glowing form of the descending fortress shifted slightly to track the intermittent green flashes cutting through the no man's land below. The stormtroopers of the Inquisitorial 703rd were surprised to see us coming up the hill, not having expected anyone to walk away from that bannerblade crash. That surprise was nothing compared to learning just who had been driving said bannerblade. Word that Lady General von Humperdinck's daughter had been recovered and needed medical treatment and extraction galvanized the stormtroopers even more than the previous demonic incursion and surprise orc invasion. Treating the battered squad like some sort of high honor guard, everyone was rushed into the nearest medic tent where Amy was immediately jumped to the front of the queue, followed, after a brief trudge, by Doc. Jim and Tink were instructed to walk it off, and Sarge was given a spot somewhere in the middle, clenching his line number in his remaining hand and desperately wishing it was a beer instead. Sarge went back out of the medic tent to find Nubby still arguing with the sentries and their gene scanner, maintaining that if his DNA registered as an Inquisitorial stormtrooper in good standing, with citation for exemplary service in the protection of a bunch of fracking scribes, they didn't need his thrown damned fingerprints asking the sentries if they really wanted to see more of Nubby's skin. Sarge defused the situation, dragged the little trooper over toward the medic tent, and sat down next to Tink and Jim to watch as the massive, glowing orbital cathedral of demon containment smashed into the ground. Once again wishing for a beer, Sarge saluted the flashes of green light coming from somewhere near the cathedral's base and started counting down to the inevitable. Twitch laughed maniacally as he scrambled down the hillside through the battlefield, cutting a swathe through the greenskin hordes with his brand new Zenitech Orc Eliminator. A small, still sane portion of Twitch's mind knew it wasn't just greenskins being sucked into the Audomalius cube thingy that powered his new weapon, but it had decided to stop worrying about that. Instead, it was chewing over that other group of orcs it had seen. The Gretchen had to have been either Nubby or the world's bravest grot, and the two mech boys that had been fiddling with his new weapon had to be Jim and Tink, but he hadn't been sure about any of the others. All he could see when he'd looked at them were hulking greenskins barking at each other and him in their own guttural language, which was unfair, since Twitch did in fact know Orcish. None of that really mattered, though, because Twitch's mind, sane or otherwise, was just along for the ride at this point. It had taken a heroic amount of effort to fight back the panic long enough to figure out what he had to do to fix everything. His orcified comrades had just stared blankly at him as he clearly explained that they needed to take the box with the demon out of the thingy and put the empty one into it before tank go boom. After how much effort that had taken, Twitch hadn't even tried to convey his desperate plan to throw the inevitable inquisitorial pursuit, conspiracy and otherwise, off their trail. So instead, once he'd tesseracted the exploding banner blade, Twitch had turned himself downhill and let his adrenaline take the reins. Despite the horrors surrounding him, Twitch kept laughing because even if he was beset on all sides by greenskins in increasingly odd attire, and even if there was what appeared to be an entire rock full of them descending straight at him, he held the answer to all of his problems quite literally in his hands. It was hard to be afraid when wielding a Xenotech weapon that quite literally deleted his enemies. There wasn't even shrapnel to worry about. Unfortunately, that feeling of invincibility ended before he got a chance to see if the rock would fit inside his new toy. Midway through his rampage, the Xenotech tablet informed him that it was at 25% remaining charge and promptly deactivated. Cursing Tink, Theo, Smith, Jim, and all tech priests in general, Twitch tried to yank the Necron cube out and activate it by hand somehow, but he barely even reached for it before the tranq darts hit him. The first thought to skitter across Twitch's mind as he regained consciousness was that orcs definitely didn't use tranq darts, and now that he had a few spare seconds to look around, the only action he was capable of, the orcs around him were decidedly half-assed. He was almost certain that there was no such thing as an Inquisitor, and even if there were, they wouldn't be caught dead wearing fancy robes with chaos squigles written on them. Twitch dearly hoped that this was all Owen's fault, because he would have liked to have believed that his own mind would have put a little more effort into his sudden but inevitable mental breakdown. The large, dimly lit chamber was filled with guttural chanting and flashes of warpy light as the crowd of impostorks did whatever the hell they were doing. Whatever it was, this did not appear to involve Twitch in any way, since he was being held to the side of things by a pair of servitorks. These, he was less sure about. He had, after all, seen them before. At least he was doing better than the long-haired Ordomorcus Inquisitor chained in the middle of the ritual circle next to the glowing Necron box. Twitch was indignant at this misuse of his property and attempted to inform the servitorks holding him of this grave injustice. But all that came out was a few panting giggles and a stream of drool. They seemed to understand and sympathize with his plight. Oddly, despite all the comically inaccurate Inquisitorks and the Spork Marines and the throne-damned Sistork of battle, one of the greenskins didn't look stupid. Twitch eyed the out-of-place commando. Unlike the others with their stupid hats, the commandos sported a highly effective cardboard space marine mask, and had emblazoned his chest plate with stupid beaky. In fact, the illusion was so good that, for a second, Twitch was pretty sure it was a commando, but the way it stepped from shadow to shadow was distinctly unorky. Commandos, he was pretty sure, had to cross the ground between the shadows, too. Or at least, that's what he hoped. Twitch couldn't move his head, or anything really, after he'd been shot full of those darts, but he could still control his eyes, and he focused them on the odd greenskin as it stepped out of the pillar next to the two servitorks and their captive. Oh Humi, what's in our box? Twitch struggled, and between giggles, managed his answer. Orcs, full of orcs, but not like you. Orcs, double orcs, and, hairy box full of hairy orcs. Twitch grinned manically, unable to force any more words out, and then, to his surprise, the commando lifted up his mask and grinned back. Bloody classic, that's exactly what I woulda done. Nobody ever expects da hairy orcs. And then the orc was gone, leaving Twitch alone with the chanting of the probably not orcs rising to a crescendo. And then, they opened the box. In a flash of green necrotic light, the center of the chamber was suddenly filled with a massive heaving pile of orcs, squigs, every single grenade, landmine, and miscellaneous inflammable that Twitch could find on his rampage through the no man's land. And somewhere deep in the middle, One very, very unhappy Bannerblade, mustering the last of his strength, Twitch cackled triumphantly as the massive pile of greenskins and ordnance detonated. As the partially slagged chamber cooled to nearly survivable levels, the pristine black form of a Deathwatch Marine with a Raven badge on its shoulder stepped out of a pool of shadow near the crater in the room's center and descended to claim the unscathed Necron cube sitting in its lowest point. By the time the assorted Audomalia's underlings got up the courage to check on their bosses, he was already gone. Alright, that's a wrap for now, so let's talk current happenings. This is not quite the end. We still have a couple of epilogues to go to show the ultimate fate of many of the characters. However, this is the end of the All Guardsmen party proper, and no, there is no plan to do a follow-up campaign or another writing project on this scale. This thing was a huge undertaking. However, just because we're not doing AGP stories specifically doesn't mean we're doing nothing at all. For instance, one thing that Shoggy has done is get 3D models of all of the All Guardsmen party, plus Amy, Fumbles, and the Occurrence border. We're holding a Kickstarter to recoup costs. Please donate if you're interested. When we hit the goal, the models will be free for everyone. What's more, Shoggy has been up to some other shenanigans, such as a campaign run by me called Regiment on the Run. We've got all the videos up on Shoggy's YouTube channel. Finally, I would heavily recommend joining the Shoggy Seldom Stories Discord server if you've got a mind for tabletop games, silly stories, and an accepting community. Link is on the All Guardsmen party website. Speaking of that website, we'll have the final chapter uploaded at some point in the nearish future. No promises on how long that'll take. We finally did it. We finally fracking did it. The final chapter is released at last. Yes. Shoutouts to the following people. Iona Murson Art drew 2 of the original artworks used in the final chapter. Becky, our server artist, who drew all of these adorable emotes that I've been using. She also drew the amazing artwork of Unknown Owen Leo, who made the Bane vs Ivana artwork. Bushat Conjoined Editist, who drew artwork of Tink and Spot, the folks at Sutungra Miniatures, for making the 3D models and the renders we use liberally throughout the chapter. Firehat and Primrose, our 2 server moderators who have been keeping the place safe, and Civil Shoggy, for having me on this project. Our entire Discord community, for being such a wonderful place that I love checking on every day. You, for reading. Yes, your interest is what kept this project alive. Oof, that's a lot. Once again, please consider donating to the Kickstarter and helping us recoup costs. Now, that's all from me. I got to start winding down.
So, the end. Not gonna lie, I'm actually, I'm really sad to see the All Guardsmen party, over. It's something that I've been wishing for and longing for so long, but the All Guardsmen party, to me anyway, it's genuinely, it's a huge part of my, my adult life. I know that sounds really weird to say, especially with it being well, it's the greatest fan fiction ever made. Let's be serious. It's more than, to me, it's more than just a storytime guide up. So much of my life has changed for the better, and I don't really know how else to explain that. I know that sounds I don't want to get all hippy dippy with you guys and whatnot. Mostly because, can we just pour one out for Shocky, please? Honestly, the best way to support him is to go ahead, check out his Kickstarter. He's got the models, they're done, they're finished. I'm actually messing about with supports at the minute. He was very, very kind, because he sent me a load of assets over, and he also sent me the models with them. So I'm gonna be getting them printed out in the next couple of days. If you guys aren't aware though, me and Megan just had another baby, so one of those ones. Hopefully I'll be able to get to them sooner rather than later, but I'm not gonna hold my breath. But definitely you should go ahead, check out the Kickstarter, because if you're still here, which is saying something, because I don't think we've uploaded on this channel in maybe a year and a half, maybe a bit more at this point. And it's I don't know, it's just such a story. And honestly, oh my god, Twitch, man, Twitch, doing what he loved best. I don't know. Look, I feel like this is going to meander. I feel like I'm kind of lost for words, honestly, because it has been such a huge part of my adult life, and I don't know if the All Guardsmen party really helped this channel stand on its feet, and it turned me from it created me a full-time job. You know, being able to interact and do things that I love. And that's amazing, that's great, but it's also done far more for me. I don't know if you can hear the baby crying downstairs or not, but yeah, that's what it has achieved. Like, I'm not even joking, the Old Guardsmen Party has given me, and like all the other stories like that on this channel, give me the opportunity to be able to like be with my kids all the time. Do you know what I mean? And be able to work from home and be self-employed. Now, you guys know I don't really do YouTube that much anymore. Where Megan's stepped back, she's only on Unhinged, and it's only me and Garbrew doing like a video like every once in a while. Like, you know, we haven't uploaded in a couple of weeks now. But again, like babies here. But you guys know that we're stepping back from YouTube and we're working on more like faceless online stores. You know, but I don't know if. I don't know if what we were doing today would have happened if it wasn't for doing YouTube. Does that make any sense? But again, like, you know, we started this, like, you know, whenever I was only like 20. I was 22 at the time, and I'm now 30. Well, I'm 31 in like next month, you know, and so who knows? Maybe my life would have went in this direction anyway. But to me, it still feels like a very intrinsic point in my life. Does that make any sense? It feels like if these things didn't happen, then I wouldn't be the same person as I am today, you know. And for that, I can only say fuck. Thank you, Shoggy. Jesus Christ, it's been a wild ride, genuine. I feel like I am getting a wee bit emotional, if I be honest with you, and I'm sorry about that, but it's kind of hard not to. You know, the All Guardsmen Party has been something that's been very close to my heart for a very, very long time, and I am kind of sad to see it over. Not gonna lie, I actually am. Here, I still be George R. R. Martin, you know what I mean? So that's pretty sweet, isn't it? And like, you know, to actually make the end, that's amazing. Genuinely outstanding, amazing job. I'm so happy that he managed it. And like, you know, Shoggy's had some really like ups and downs in his life. One person I think I would like to bring up is Shoggy's dear uncle, who sadly passed away, but from all intents and purposes, he seems integral to his love of writing and his definitely his style of writing. There's no hiding that there's a lot of Discworld influences, and you know, that's something that without that influence, who knows what we would have, or if we would even have this story at all to begin with, or even like, you know, Soggy said, the Shadowgun story time was a big influence on him for doing the All Guardsmen Party, and like, you know, you can see that as well. You know, everyone bounces off of each other, but look, sorry, I'm sorry, I'm rambling now, and I know this is a bit of a mess, and I wish I could be a bit more proper and a bit more, oh no, this is this and this is that, and you guys know that's not my style, you know. I just hope that you guys that have stayed about for this long are happy with the ending, because I certainly am, you know. Oh my god. The other thing, also there is going to be some epilogues. I am going to do that as a separate video, but I didn't know how long it was going to be before they were out, and I really wanted to get this video out. So once all the epilogues are done, then that'll be probably the last video on this channel, unless maybe at some point in the future I come back. You know, you never know. I like to leave the door open, but at the minute, you know, I've got 2 very young kids, doing other businesses that are keeping me up at night, to say the least. But you know, they're working and they're doing well, and you know, it is hard, but hopefully I would like to maybe come back to this channel at some point, but that's for the future. So I would say definitely don't unsubscribe anyway, and keep your notification bell on, but it's going to be a long time before you probably see this notification bell again, but after this epilogue. Oh my god, guys, what the fuck is going on with me? I actually do feel like I'm about to guard. Jesus Christ. Fuck. Oh my word. I'm sorry. This is actually good. I kind of yes and no. Yes and no to feel so emotional over this. It feels kind of silly, not gonna lie. It feels very silly. But look, so I feel like I'm just gonna ramble here if I don't hurry up. The Kickstarter's down below. Choggy put a lot of money into getting these models. He is also, so you can back it, but you don't have to back it. The thing is, he's going to be putting out the models completely for free anyway. The stretch goal, or the goal is for him to get his money back out of the Kickstarter, because models cost a lot of money to get produced, like a serious amount of money. So definitely, please go ahead, check it out. I don't know, like, you know, you can get your hands on the files. It is the best way to support support him and help him, like, you know, get his money back out. And again, I don't think he's going to be making any money off it. The other big thing would be check out his Discord server. I've got that linked down below. Joining that is the best way by far to keep up to speed with everything Shoggy related. And honestly, everything the guy touches is fucking gold. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm kind of like, he used to do a lot of YouTube videos, and he had a good few of them like really take off. He was really big into Total War for ages there. But yeah, look, one of those ones. If you want to keep up to speed with him, just do it. Trust me. And as always, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. And yeah, this is the end, at least for now. Well, at least till next week, until we get the epilogues in. But look, I'm sorry, we're almost 10 minutes in, and I feel like I haven't said anything, and I feel like I'm just lamping, and I'm just kind of be like, oh, I'm really sad. Look, guys, it's been a big part of my life. Leave me alone, okay? I'm allowed to be a wee bit emotional, especially because it feels like this is the end for anyway. It feels like everything has came full circle for me anyway, especially when it comes to YouTube, and with the All Guardsmen Party being like the first like big story time we ever did, or bar actually Cold Shoulder sector. I think we did Cold Shoulder first, but All Guardsmen Party was still fucking amazing though. Like, you know, it still doesn't matter. Oh my god. Look, sorry guys. I'm sorry. I wish I could be a bit more professional at this. I wish I could give you a proper speech and a proper everything, but that just ain't me. So I'll see you guys about. Bye.